There is a ship at the bottom of a river, not the bottom of the ocean, where wreckage might disappear into darkness and be forgotten by the world above, but sitting in the shallows of a South American estuary, visible from the shore, close enough that civilians watched it burn from the waterfront of a neutral city. A warship, one of the most feared vessels in the German fleet, destroyed not by a superior enemy in glorious combat, but by the deliberate hand of her own captain, and 3 days after giving that order, the man who gave it was dead too, wrapped in the battle ensign of the Imperial German Navy that had trained him decades before the war that killed him. This is not a story that begins with an explosion. It begins with paper, with treaties and clauses, and the careful, humiliating arithmetic of a nation stripped of its military pride. It begins in the years after the First World War, when a defeated Germany sat down at a table and was told exactly what kind of navy it was permitted to have, and then spent the next decade quietly, methodically, building something else entirely. It is a story about deception at the highest level, about a ship designed to look like one thing while being another, about a captain who followed orders he sometimes despised, about 3 smaller ships that had no business winning the fight they started, and very nearly didn't, about a neutral port city that became the stage for one of the most extraordinary diplomatic confrontations of the entire war, and ultimately about what happens when a man of genuine honor finds himself serving a regime that has no use for it. The Battle of the River Plate, fought in December of 1939, was the first major naval engagement of the Second World War. It took place before the fall of France, before the Blitz, before most of the defining events that the war would become famous for. In those early months, the outcome of the conflict was still genuinely uncertain. Britain had declared war on Germany and was doing so largely alone, stretched across an ocean it could not adequately police, watching its merchant ships disappear one by one. The Graf Spee had been hunting in the South Atlantic for months by the time 3 British cruisers caught up with her, and by every conventional measure of naval power, she should have destroyed them. She did not. What happened instead, across roughly 2 hours of brutal combat at dawn on the 13th of December 1939, and the 4 extraordinary days that followed in Montevideo harbor, changed the course of the naval war, lifted British morale at a moment when it desperately needed lifting, and ended with one of the most haunting final acts any military commander has left behind. We are going to walk through every part of it tonight, and when we say every part, we mean it. This documentary covers the complete history of the Graf Spee from her conception in the Shroud of Versailles to the smoke rising from her hull as she settled into the mud of the River Plate. We are going to talk about the engineering decisions that made her dangerous and the political decisions that made her existence technically legal, barely. We are going to meet Commodore Henry Harwood, a British naval officer who made a prediction about where one ship would appear in an entire ocean, was right, and then ordered a tactically audacious attack that most officers of the period would have called reckless. We are going to meet Captain Hans Langsdorff, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as something far more complicated than either, a man whose personal code of conduct made him one of the most respected enemy officers of the entire war, and whose end made him one of its most melancholy figures. We will sit with the crew of the Exeter as 11-inch shells tear through her. We will watch the Ajax and Achilles wheel and fire and lay smoke and keep fighting long after the arithmetic of the engagement said they should have retreated. We will stand on the waterfront of Montevideo with thousands of Uruguayan civilians who watched this drama unfold in real time and could scarcely believe what they were seeing. We will follow the diplomats and the bluffs and the radio transmissions designed to make a trapped captain believe his situation was more hopeless than it already was. And we will end where the story ends, in a hotel room in Buenos Aires, and in the shallow waters of a river where a warship still rests today. This is the kind of story that long-form documentary was built for. It is the kind of story that rewards patience, the kind where the background matters as much as the battle, where the character of the people involved shapes every decision that gets made, where the outcome, though you may already know it, still manages to feel uncertain as you approach it, because the path there is so strange, so full of turns, so genuinely human. If you are settling in tonight for something that will carry you through the hours, something with weight and texture and the kind of detail that makes history feel less like a list of events and more like a story actually lived by actual people, then you are in exactly the right place. Get comfortable. If you have a blanket, pull it closer. If you have something warm to drink, now is the time. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. This is going to be a long, unhurried journey through one of the most extraordinary episodes of the Second World War, and we are going to take our time with it. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists to give long-form history the treatment it deserves. Deep, carefully researched, written to be listened to as much as watched, paced for the kind of audience that doesn't want things rushed. If you find tonight's documentary the kind of company you want for the hours ahead, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more where this comes from, and every documentary we make is built with this exact kind of night in mind. For those of you who have been here before, thank you, genuinely, for coming back. Settle in. We're glad you're here. The River Plate, December 1939. A German warship, 3 British cruisers, a neutral harbour, a captain running out of options, a world just 3 months into a war that would last 6 more years and kill tens of millions. And right at the beginning of all of it, this. One ship, one battle, one man's final choice. Let's go back to where it started. There is a particular kind of humiliation that does not fade with time. It settles into the bones of a nation, quiet and cold, waiting for the moment when pride and fury find each other again. For Germany, that moment arrived not with a single declaration or a single man, but with the slow, grinding passage of years spent under the weight of a treaty that had been written not as peace, but as punishment. The First World War had ended in November of 1918, and within months the victorious powers had gathered at Versailles to determine what remained of German ambition. What they produced was a document of deliberate constraint, one that stripped Germany of territory, wealth, and the instruments of military power. Among those instruments, none were surrendered more painfully than the ships of the Imperial German Navy, a fleet built over decades of national sacrifice, now handed over at gunpoint to the men who had defeated it. The Treaty of Versailles was precise in its cruelty toward German sea power. The new republic, the Weimar Republic, fragile and unwanted by nearly everyone who governed it, was forbidden from building warships above 10,000 tons displacement. It could not possess submarines. It could not build aircraft carriers. The great dreadnoughts that had clashed with the Royal Navy at Jutland were gone, surrendered or scuttled, and what remained of the German fleet was a collection of aging pre-war vessels barely capable of defending the Baltic coast. The architects of Versailles believed they had solved the problem of German naval power for a generation. They had not. They had merely forced German engineers to become creative. The men who worked inside the newly formed German Naval Office during the 1920s were not dreamers. They were professionals trained in a rigorous tradition of naval architecture, and they understood the limits placed upon them with mathematical clarity. 10,000 tons. That was the ceiling. But tonnage is not destiny, and a ship's danger to an enemy is not simply a function of how much steel she displaces. The question German designers asked themselves was a different one entirely. Within these restrictions, what kind of vessel could cause the greatest possible disruption to British trade? The answer they arrived at was elegant in concept and radical in execution. Build a ship fast enough to escape a battleship, powerful enough to destroy a cruiser, and rangy enough to roam the oceans alone for months. In theory, this was impossible within 10,000 tons. In practice, German engineering found a way, or at least claimed to have found one. The design that emerged in the late 1920s was unlike anything that had preceded it. Where traditional cruisers sacrificed either speed or firepower to stay within acceptable weight limits, German designers made different choices. They specified electric welding rather than riveting for the hull, saving hundreds of tons of steel. They chose diesel engines over steam turbines, heavier in some respects, but dramatically more fuel efficient, giving the new ship a theoretical range that put virtually every ocean within reach. And they armed her with guns that had no business being on a ship of her official classification. 2 triple turrets carrying 11-inch caliber weapons, more powerful than anything a comparable Allied vessel could match. The result was a vessel that sat in a category no one had quite designed against, too heavily armed to be ignored, too fast to be easily caught. The German press celebrated it. The British naval staff quietly began asking uncomfortable questions. The first 2 ships of this new class appeared through the early 1930s, and the world took note. Officially, Germany classified them as armoured ships, a deliberately vague designation that skirted Versailles terminology while obscuring their true capabilities. The British called them pocket battleships, a nickname that carried a mixture of grudging admiration and genuine concern. The name was partly dismissive, suggesting something miniaturized and therefore lesser, but anyone who looked honestly at the specifications understood that diminutive was not the same as weak. A pocket battleship carrying 11-inch guns and capable of sustaining high speeds across thousands of nautical miles was not a second-rate vessel. It was a commerce raider of the first order, purpose-built for a war the world had not yet admitted was coming. The third ship of the class was laid down in the autumn of 1932, before Adolf Hitler had consolidated power in Germany. But she took shape and grew during the years in which the National Socialist regime remade German society from the ground up. She was launched in the summer of 1934 from the Germania shipyard in Kiel, and when she entered full service in January of 1936, she was named after Admiral Maximilian von Spee, the German naval commander who had won a remarkable victory against the British at Coronel in 1914, before being defeated and killed at the Falkland Islands just weeks later. The choice of name was not accidental. Spee was a figure of martial elegance, a commander who had taken his ships to the ends of the earth and fought with distinction. Naming the new vessel after him was a declaration of intent wrapped in historical reverence. The Admiral Graf Spee would carry his legacy into new waters. By the time she commissioned, the political context around her had changed completely. Hitler's government had already violated Versailles openly and repeatedly. In 1935, Germany had announced the existence of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, in defiance of treaty prohibitions. That same year, it had signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which tacitly permitted German rearmament at sea in exchange for limiting the German fleet to a fraction of Royal Navy tonnage. The agreement was Britain's attempt to manage German expansion through diplomacy rather than confrontation. It succeeded mainly in legitimizing what Germany was already doing. The Graf Spee, built under the old Versailles restrictions but now sailing under a regime that had largely discarded them, was the physical expression of two overlapping deceptions. The deception of the treaty years, when her tonnage figures were quietly massaged in official documents, and the broader deception of the Hitler government, which spoke of peace while building for war. It is worth pausing here to consider what the Graf Spee actually was beneath the politics and the propaganda. She was a ship of genuine sophistication. Her main armament gave her a reach and a striking power that could destroy any cruiser the British or French navies might send against her in single combat. Her diesel power plant allowed her to travel at full speed across the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans without refueling for weeks at a time. Her fire control systems were among the most advanced afloat, capable of directing accurate gunfire at extreme ranges under difficult sea conditions. She carried a float plane for reconnaissance, allowing her captain to see beyond the horizon and identify targets or threats before they came within visual range from the deck. She was, in every measurable sense, engineered for a single mission: to find and destroy the merchant vessels that fed the British war economy, and to do so far from home, alone, for as long as possible. The man chosen to command her was not a fanatic. Captain Hans Langsdorff had served in the Imperial Navy during the First World War, had witnessed Jutland from the bridge of a ship, and had come through the experience with both his life and his professional reputation intact. He was cultured, steady, and possessed of the kind of measured authority that technical officers respect. He was not the ideal figure of National Socialist mythology, not bellowing, not theatrical, not consumed by ideology. He was a naval officer in the classical tradition, which would eventually place him at odds with everything the war around him demanded. But in the middle years of the 1930s, as the Graf Spee worked up through sea trials and exercises, those contradictions had not yet become fatal. He had a fine ship, a capable crew, and orders that had not yet required him to choose between his conscience and his duty. The years between her commissioning and the outbreak of war were not idle ones for the Graf Spee. She participated in fleet exercises, flew the German naval ensign in foreign ports, and made a prominent appearance during the Spanish Civil War as part of the so-called non-intervention patrol, a darkly comic exercise in which European powers, nominally monitoring the conflict, used it as a proving ground for their own weapons and crews. The Graf Spee moved through those waters with the quiet confidence of a ship that knew what she was built for, watched by foreign naval attachés who filed their reports and worried. The British Admiralty, reading those reports, began the slow process of imagining what a war against this ship would look like. The scenarios they drew up were not reassuring. In the summer of 1939, as European diplomacy collapsed in slow motion and the certainty of war replaced the pretense of peace, the Graf Spee was brought to full operational readiness. Stores were loaded, ammunition was topped off, and Langsdorff received his sealed orders. The mission was unchanged from the one her designers had imagined a decade earlier: commerce raiding across the southern oceans, striking at the arteries of British trade until Britain's will or capacity to fight was broken. She would operate alone, supported occasionally by a supply tanker, in waters where the nearest German port was thousands of nautical miles away, and friendly assistance was a diplomatic fiction. She left Germany quietly in mid-August of 1939, slipping out before the formal declaration of war, taking her position in the South Atlantic while Europe held its breath for the last time. The plan that had been drawn up across years of careful, patient engineering was now, finally, in motion, and almost no one in the world yet knew where she was. She was not built to be admired. She was built to kill quietly, far from shore, in waters where no help could reach her victims and no witness could report her position. The Admiral Graf Spee, named for the German vice-admiral who fell at the Battle of the Falkland Islands in 1914, carried that legacy in her very name. There was something deliberate in that choice. The original Graf Spee had died commanding a squadron that roamed the Pacific and Atlantic, sinking British warships before being hunted down and destroyed. Now, more than 2 decades later, the German Navy had built something new in his memory. Not a ghost, but a machine shaped by lessons learned from defeat, and designed to ensure that defeat would not happen again. The German naval command of the early 1930s faced a problem that was equal parts political and engineering. The Treaty of Versailles had capped German warships at 10,000 tons displacement, a ceiling intended to prevent Germany from ever again threatening British naval supremacy. But German designers, working with cold precision and nationalist ambition, treated that ceiling not as a limitation, but as a design brief. They asked themselves a single question: what is the most dangerous ship we can build within these boundaries? The answer was the Panzerschiff, the armoured ship, a class of vessel the foreign press mockingly called a pocket battleship. The mockery was premature. These ships were neither pocket-sized in their destructive capacity nor crude imitations of anything. They were something genuinely new, built around a philosophy of calculated aggression, and the Graf Spee was the finest of the 3 that Germany launched during that period. She entered service in January of 1937, and from the moment she did, she represented a direct challenge to every assumption the Royal Navy held about the balance of power at sea. Her dimensions told only part of the story. Roughly 186 meters in length, she displaced somewhere in the vicinity of 16,000 tons when fully loaded, already exceeding the Versailles limit, though Germany had long since ceased to acknowledge that treaty's legitimacy. What made her formidable was not size alone, but the ruthless efficiency of her armament. She carried 6 11-inch guns arranged in 2 triple turrets, one forward and one aft, weapons powerful enough to shatter a standard cruiser at ranges beyond 15 kilometers. She also carried 8 5.9-inch secondary guns, numerous anti-aircraft weapons, and torpedo tubes. Against any cruiser in the world, and there were many, she held a decisive firepower advantage. Against a battleship or battlecruiser, she held one equally decisive advantage of a different kind. She could simply run. Powered by diesel engines rather than conventional steam turbines, she could sustain speeds sufficient to disengage from anything that outgunned her, and she could do so across enormous distances. Her operational range was extraordinary. She could travel more than 16,000 nautical miles without refueling, nearly twice around the world at the equator. She was, by design, a creature of the deep ocean, comfortable in the loneliest stretches of water on Earth. Her designers had also thought carefully about what commerce raiding actually required in practice. It was not enough to be powerful and fast. A raider operating alone, weeks from the nearest friendly port, needed to be self-sufficient. The Graf Spee carried workshops capable of performing significant mechanical repairs at sea. She carried an aircraft, a Heinkel float plane, catapulted from her deck, for scouting and reconnaissance, extending her eyes far beyond the horizon. Her range-finding and fire control systems incorporated technology that most navies were only beginning to develop. She could identify a target, calculate its course and speed, and open accurate fire at distances that would have seemed implausible to naval officers of the previous generation. Everything about her had been considered. Everything had been weighted against the demands of operating alone in hostile waters for months at a time. She was not a ship built for fleet actions or harbour parades. She was built for the hunt. Into this vessel, the German Navy poured a crew of exceptional quality. Hand-picked is perhaps too gentle a word. The officers and senior ratings who served aboard the Graf Spee were selected for their technical competence, their psychological resilience, and their capacity to operate under sustained stress without the support structures that larger fleets could provide. A crew raiding merchant routes in the South Atlantic could not radio Berlin for guidance on every decision. They would face mechanical failures, navigational uncertainty, and tactical choices with no superior officer within thousands of kilometers. The men selected for this role had to be capable of independent judgment, disciplined enough to remain effective after weeks of isolation, and steady enough not to break when things went wrong, because things would inevitably go wrong. At the center of this crew stood Hans Langsdorff. He assumed command of the Graf Spee in the mid-1930s, and from the beginning he impressed those who served under him with qualities that were not necessarily common among senior naval officers of the period. He was thorough without being rigid. He was demanding without being cruel. He had seen war before. He had served at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the largest naval engagement of the First World War, and had come away from that experience with something many young officers never developed: a genuine understanding of what naval combat cost in human terms. Langsdorff was, by multiple accounts of those who knew him, a man who took that cost seriously. He did not speak of glory the way some of his contemporaries did. He spoke of responsibility, to his crew, to the mission, and, in ways that would become increasingly complicated as the war progressed, to the men on the ships he was ordered to destroy. His background placed him squarely within the tradition of the Imperial German Navy, that proud institution which had been humiliated at Scapa Flow in 1919, when its interned fleet was scuttled by its own crews rather than surrendered to the British. Langsdorff had grown up professionally in the shroud of that humiliation. Every officer of his generation had. The Kriegsmarine, the new German navy that emerged under the Nazi regime, was an institution hungry to restore what had been lost, to prove that German seamanship and German engineering could compete with the greatest naval power the world had ever known. Langsdorff embodied that hunger, but tempered it. He understood that the Graf Spee's mission was not to seek heroic destruction, but to achieve strategic effect through sustained, disciplined action. A dead ship wins nothing. A ship that sinks a dozen merchantmen and returns to port intact had changed the war. Training aboard the Graf Spee reflected this philosophy. Langsdorff drilled his crew relentlessly in damage control, in gunnery, in the mechanics of operating at sea for extended periods. He ran exercises that assumed communication blackouts, that assumed the loss of key personnel, that assumed, again and again, that the ship would have no one to rely on except herself. The culture he built was one of quiet competence rather than theatrical bravado. Officers were expected to know each other's roles well enough to fill them at short notice. Ratings were expected to understand not just their own duties, but the broader logic of what the ship was doing and why. It was, in some ways, an unusually thoughtful approach to command, in an era when military culture often prioritized obedience above all other virtues. By 1939, ship and crew had trained together long enough to function as something close to a single organism. The Graf Spee was not simply a collection of weapons and machinery with men attached. She was a practiced instrument, finely calibrated, and those aboard her understood her capabilities and her limits with the intimacy of long familiarity. They knew the particular sound her engines made when the diesels were running at maximum output. They knew which compartments ran hot in the tropics and which condensed moisture in the colder latitudes. They knew the subtle movements of a hull that spent its life at sea rather than in harbour. This knowledge, accumulated through years of training and maintenance, was as much a part of the ship's fighting power as her guns. What the German Navy had produced, when viewed honestly, was a vessel that defied easy categorization and, in defying it, created a genuine strategic problem for the British Admiralty. She was too powerful for any cruiser to engage without serious risk of destruction. She was too fast for any battleship or battle cruiser to catch in open water if she chose to run. She could range across the entire South Atlantic and beyond without assistance. She could strike, vanish, refuel from pre-positioned supply vessels, and strike again. Against her, the old calculus of naval power, more tonnage, more guns, more hulls, did not straightforwardly apply. Stopping her required finding her first, and finding a single ship in an ocean of that size required either extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary luck, or both. Those at the British Admiralty who had studied her specifications in the years before the war had understood the danger she represented. They had no clean answer to it. There was no single British ship that could engage her with confidence and expect to prevail. The only workable solution was to hunt in groups, to assign multiple cruisers to patrol likely raiding areas, and hope that at least one group would be in the right place when she appeared. It was a strategy born of necessity rather than confidence, and everyone involved knew its limitations. The ocean was simply too large, the raider too capable, and the available ships too few. She sailed into history carrying all of this with her: the engineering ambitions of a defeated nation, the tactical vision of a navy fighting to redeem itself, the quiet authority of a captain who understood both the power and the price of what he commanded, and the skills of a crew that had been shaped, deliberately and carefully, for exactly this kind of war. Whatever would come next, and much would come, it would not come to a ship that was unprepared. The Graf Spee went to war, knowing what she was, knowing what she was for, and carrying, in the minds of every man aboard her, the weight of everything that had been invested in her creation. The 1st of September, 1939. Across the plains of Poland, German armoured columns crossed the border before sunrise, and the world that had existed for 20 years, fragile, anxious, held together by diplomacy and wishful thinking, began to come apart. 2 days later, Britain and France honoured their treaty obligations and declared war on the Third Reich. Church bells rang in London. Chamberlain's voice came across the wireless, measured and worn. In homes across Britain, families gathered around radio sets and understood, without anyone having to explain, that the world had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Meanwhile, in the South Atlantic, more than 9,000 kilometers from the burning Polish corridor, a warship steamed quietly through open ocean. She had been there for days already. She was waiting for exactly this moment. The Graf Spee had slipped out of Wilhelmshaven in the final week of August 1939, departing under the cover of routine naval exercises before the first shot of the war had ever been fired. This was not improvisation. It was premeditated. The German High Command understood that war was coming, and they intended to have their commerce raiders already in position when the killing began, positioned like pieces on a board placed before the game was announced. The supply ship Altmark accompanied her at a distance, carrying fuel, provisions, and the capacity to extend the Graf Spee's range far beyond what her own tanks could sustain. Together, the two vessels crossed into the South Atlantic and entered a holding pattern, waiting for the orders that would transform a tense peace into open war. When the signal finally came, it was almost a relief. Captain Hans Langsdorff received his operational orders and understood them precisely. He was to wage commerce warfare against Allied merchant shipping, to sink vessels carrying goods, fuel, food, and raw materials to Britain, strangling the island nation's war economy one hull at a time. The logic was cold and clear. Britain depended on imported goods to survive, let alone to fight. A nation that could not feed itself or fuel its industry could not sustain a modern war. If the Graf Spee and the other German surface raiders could disrupt the Atlantic trade routes severely enough, the British war effort might collapse under its own weight before its armies ever reached the continent in force. Langsdorff knew his orders. He also knew something else. He was entirely alone. There would be no support, no escort, no rescue if something went wrong. The South Atlantic was his theatre, and he would run it as he judged best. The first victim came in late September, a British freighter, fully loaded, making her way along one of the standard Atlantic routes, the kind of ship the British Empire depended on absolutely, unremarkable in peacetime and vital in war. She was alone on the water, unarmed except for a single old deck gun that was no match for an 11-inch naval rifle at any range. Langsdorff followed his established procedure. He approached, identified the vessel, and gave her crew time to abandon ship before his gunners opened fire. It was not mercy as the world ordinarily understood it. The ship was still destroyed, her cargo lost to the ocean floor, but it was a discipline Langsdorff imposed on himself and his crew as a matter of deliberate principle. His prisoners were brought aboard the Graf Spee and treated according to the conventions of war. His log recorded the action without celebration. He was not a man who found satisfaction in sinking merchant ships. What followed over the next weeks was a slow, methodical campaign conducted across an ocean so vast that the concept of patrolling it seemed almost abstract. The South Atlantic stretches across millions of square kilometers, with shipping lanes that are more suggestion than structure. Broad corridors where vessels tend to travel, but where the ocean itself provides no boundaries, no walls, no way to guarantee that a raider will be found. The Graf Spee moved through this emptiness with a calculated unpredictability, hunting in one area and then disappearing into another, crossing from the African side of the Atlantic to the South American side and back again, never staying long enough in any single region for a pattern to emerge. She changed course frequently. She maintained radio silence to prevent direction finding. She was, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult to locate. Each sinking followed a similar pattern, and each one revealed something important about the fundamental vulnerability of unescorted merchant shipping in wartime. The freighters and tankers of 1939 were not built for combat. They were built for cargo, for efficiency, for economy. Their crews were merchant sailors, men who understood engines and tides and cargo manifests, not naval gunnery or evasive maneuvers under fire. When the Graf Spee appeared on the horizon, her 11-inch guns already trained and her speed making escape impossible, there was little that any merchant captain could realistically do. Some managed to send distress signals before being ordered to stop transmission. Some concealed their identities or changed course at the last moment. None escaped. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. A warship designed to destroy things encountering a cargo vessel designed to carry them was not a contest. It was a foregone conclusion. The British Admiralty knew, abstractly, that commerce raiders were at sea before they could confirm it through reports. The principle was not new. In the First World War, German raiders had caused enormous disruption to Allied shipping, and the lesson had been studied carefully by both sides. But knowing that a raider exists and locating it in the South Atlantic are entirely different problems. Reports began filtering in slowly, a ship overdue, a distress signal heard and then cut off, a vessel simply never arriving at its destination port. Each missing ship added to a mosaic of uncertainty that the Admiralty struggled to interpret. Where was the raider? Which raider? More than one was at sea. The ocean gave up its secrets reluctantly, and always too late. By October, Langsdorff had begun to demonstrate another dimension of the campaign: deception. The Graf Spee was capable of altering her silhouette with false funnels and modified superstructure, making identification from a distance genuinely unreliable. She sometimes signaled using the radio codes of other vessels. She approached targets from unexpected directions. These were not acts of cowardice, but of strategic intelligence. A lone ship operating without support in hostile waters could not afford to be recognized prematurely. Every additional minute of confusion bought by false appearances was a minute in which she could close range or maneuver to advantage. Langsdorff was a methodical, intelligent officer, and he ran his ship accordingly. The crews of the sunken vessels, once brought aboard as prisoners, presented Langsdorff with a secondary problem he had not fully anticipated. Keeping British merchant sailors aboard a German warship was manageable in the short term, but it created complications. They occupied space, consumed supplies, and, most critically, knew where the Graf Spee had been and roughly where she was operating. If he allowed them to reach land, they would report everything they had observed. If he kept them indefinitely, his ship would become a floating detention facility rather than a fighting vessel. His solution was to transfer prisoners to the Altmark whenever the two ships rendezvoused, keeping his own vessel relatively clear while holding survivors away from Allied intelligence for as long as possible. The arrangement worked after a fashion, though it added its own layer of moral complexity to an operation already freighted with ethical weight. Back in Britain, the shipping losses were beginning to register in a way that went beyond strategic calculation. Each vessel sunk represented cargo that would not arrive: grain, oil, machine parts, rubber, timber, the 10,000 categories of material a modern industrial nation requires to keep functioning. The people who worked those docks and counted those manifests understood the implications before politicians finished their briefings. The Atlantic was not merely a geographical feature. It was Britain's supply line, her lifeline, the physical connection between the island and everything the island needed to survive and to fight. A raider, loose in the South Atlantic, was not an annoyance. It was an existential problem wearing the shape of a single ship. Through October and November, the Graf Spee continued her work. She moved between the Brazilian coast and the African shipping lanes, striking and withdrawing, never predictable, always effective. 9 ships would eventually fall to her guns, vessels of various nationalities, various cargoes, various routes, adding up to more than 50,000 tons of Allied shipping removed from the Atlantic trade. Each loss tightened the pressure on Britain's war planners and intensified the hunt being organized across multiple ocean sectors. The Admiralty began deploying hunting groups, combinations of cruisers tasked with specific ocean zones, attempting to narrow the geometry of the search until the raider had nowhere left to disappear. It was a vast undertaking, and for weeks it produced nothing. The South Atlantic simply swallowed the question and returned only silence. What the Graf Spee's early campaign demonstrated most clearly was the degree to which naval warfare in the modern age depended not simply on firepower, but on information and its absence. The ship was powerful enough to defeat any single opponent likely to find her. The ocean was large enough to hide her indefinitely if she chose her movements carefully, and Langsdorff was disciplined enough to avoid the careless mistakes that undid less careful officers. The combination of these factors made her one of the most effective and most frustrating opponents the Royal Navy had faced since the war began. She was out there. Everyone knew she was out there. Nobody could find her. And somewhere in the southern hemisphere's long autumn swells, her captain logged his actions, transferred his prisoners, and waited to see how long the mathematics of the empty ocean would continue to favor him. The news arrived in London not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping dread. Merchant vessels were disappearing in the South Atlantic. A cargo of grain lost here. A refrigerated ship carrying meat lost there. Each one reported missing by a harbour master waiting for a vessel that would never arrive. In the early weeks of the war, the British Admiralty understood intellectually that German commerce raiders would operate against Allied shipping lanes. But understanding a threat and confronting it are two entirely different problems. The ocean between Africa and South America is not merely large, it is almost incomprehensibly vast. A wilderness of grey water stretching across millions of square kilometres, with no landmarks, no roads, no witnesses. A single warship operating within that expanse could remain invisible for weeks, even months, if her captain was disciplined and her crew well trained. The Graf Spee's captain was both, and so the disappearances continued, and the Admiralty faced a problem as old as naval warfare itself. How do you find what you cannot see? The answer was to cast a very wide net. Senior officers at the Admiralty began dividing the oceans into hunting grounds, assigning groups of warships to each zone with orders to locate, fix, and destroy the raider. These were not small patrols. They were purpose-built hunting groups, each built around a core of cruisers capable of matching or exceeding the Graf Spee's speed, paired where possible with a carrier or a faster capital ship in reserve. Force G was assigned to the South Atlantic. Force H covered the Cape of Good Hope and the waters around South Africa. Force I was committed to the Indian Ocean. Force K patrolled from the Central Atlantic. The logic was layered and deliberate. If the raider changed theaters, she would enter another hunting group's waters and face fresh hunters. The British intended to leave no ocean empty, no route unguarded. It was an enormous commitment of ships, fuel, and men, and it demanded a degree of coordination that stretched the Royal Navy's resources almost to breaking point. Among the ships assigned to Force G, 3 names would eventually become inseparable from what followed. The heavy cruiser Exeter was the group's most powerful individual unit, a ship of 8-inch guns and considerable fighting experience in her lineage. Alongside her came 2 light cruisers, Ajax and Achilles, each armed with 6-inch guns and built for speed and maneuverability, rather than raw hitting power. Ajax was a Royal Navy vessel crewed by British sailors. Achilles flew the White Ensign, but was crewed predominantly by men from New Zealand, a fact that would carry enormous weight in the weeks to come. Together, the 3 ships represented a reasonable response to a commerce raider. Enough firepower to hurt one, enough speed to chase one, enough numbers to divide one's attention. Whether they were enough to destroy one remained an open question that no one aboard was eager to answer too quickly. The challenge the hunting groups faced was not tactical but geographical. Radio direction finding, the practice of triangulating a ship's position by tracking its transmissions, was the most reliable tool available to British intelligence in the autumn of 1939. When a raider transmitted her operational reports back to Germany, or when she communicated with surface vessels, those signals could in theory be intercepted and her rough position calculated. But the South Atlantic is not a small room where sounds carry clearly. Direction finding required multiple shore stations working simultaneously, and the accuracy of any fix depended on the quality of the signal, the distance involved, and the speed at which the radar was moving. By the time a position was calculated, transmitted to London, and passed along to the hunting groups at sea, the Graf Spee might have travelled hundreds of kilometres in any direction. The intelligence was perpetually stale before it could be acted upon. Merchant reports offered another thread to pull. When a raider attacked a merchant vessel and the crew escaped in lifeboats, or when a distress signal was transmitted before the attackers jammed the frequency, British naval intelligence accumulated fragments of a picture. The problem was that each sinking provided only a point on a map, a location where the raider had been, not where she was going. A skilled commander would never remain in the same waters after an attack. He would move, change course, double back, disappear into the empty miles. What the intelligence picture gave the Admiralty was a history of the Graf Spee's movements, a trail of wreckage and grief plotted onto charts, from which analysts tried to extrapolate a future path. It was educated guessing carried out by intelligent and experienced men under pressure, and it was the best available option. The admirals in London made their deductions and moved their pieces across an ocean-spanning chessboard, but at sea, in the hunting groups themselves, the reality was far more grinding. Ships consumed fuel at a rate that made extended patrols a constant logistical problem. Warships were not designed to loiter indefinitely in the middle of an empty ocean. They were designed to move at speed toward a target, engage, and return to port. Keeping a cruiser at patrol speed for weeks, while scanning the horizon for a ship that might not appear for days, was hard on machinery, and harder still on the men operating it. The crews of Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles settled into the monotonous rhythm of watchkeeping, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, scanning an endless expanse of water and sky for a smoke plume or a silhouette that never seemed to come. Through October and into November, the Graf Spee continued to hunt. Each time she struck, she moved quickly to a new position, shifting between the South Atlantic and the waters of the Indian Ocean with a discipline that frustrated British analysts. The raider's commander clearly understood the geometry of the hunt. He knew that the British hunting groups needed to narrow down his location before they could close in, and he understood that the best defense against location was constant, unpredictable movement. Long stretches would pass with no attacks, no transmissions, no sightings, periods of silence that made the Admiralty wonder whether the ship had already turned for home, whether she had slipped past the net entirely, whether the whole effort was chasing a ghost. Then another merchant vessel would vanish, and the trail would begin again. What made the Graf Spee particularly difficult to pin down was not merely her captain's tactical judgment, though that was considerable. It was the fundamental asymmetry between attacker and defender in ocean warfare. The raider held the initiative. She could attack or not attack, move or pause, change direction at will. The hunting groups could only react, positioning themselves where they calculated the raider might appear next. There is a cruel arithmetic to this kind of search. A raider needs to be right only occasionally to remain dangerous, while the hunters need to be right precisely, in the right place at the right moment, to achieve anything at all. The South Atlantic's sheer emptiness amplified this asymmetry. Out there, between the longitude lines and the latitude markings, there were no choke points, no narrow straits, no ports where a raider would inevitably have to appear. There was only water, in every direction, for as far as any instrument could measure. The Commodore commanding Force G held his hunting groups together through a combination of professional authority and the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a long career thinking carefully about naval problems. Henry Harwood was not a man given to theatrical gestures or loud certainties. He studied the charts, he reviewed the intelligence summaries, he spoke to his captains and listened when they spoke back, and he began, gradually and through a process that was more instinct than calculation, to form a view about where the Graf Spee was likely to appear next. It was not a view he could prove with certainty. The data was incomplete, the picture was fragmentary, and any number of alternative explanations fit the available evidence just as well. But Harwood was playing a game where waiting for certainty was itself a losing strategy. The raider was somewhere in those waters, and at some point she would have to appear. The question was where. The rich shipping lanes around the mouth of the River Plate kept drawing Harwood's attention back to the same point on the chart. The estuary formed by the confluence of the Uruguay and Paraná rivers is one of the widest in the world, and the trade flowing in and out of Buenos Aires and Montevideo made it one of the busiest commercial zones in South America. Refrigerated meat from Argentina, grain from the Pampas, wool and hides destined for British factories, all of it moved through those waters in a steady stream of merchant vessels. For a commerce raider seeking targets, the area offered abundant opportunities and relatively predictable shipping patterns. It was, Harwood believed, exactly the kind of place a disciplined raider commander would eventually visit. He noted the idea. He set it aside. He returned to it again and again as the weeks passed. Meanwhile, aboard the Graf Spee, a different kind of pressure was building. Commerce raiding is not a glamorous mission for the men who carry it out. It is repetitive, isolating, and morally ambiguous work, conducted far from home and far from any possibility of rescue if things go wrong. The ship's crew lived in the knowledge that every day they spent at sea increased the probability of eventual interception, that the ocean was not truly empty, but filled with invisible hunters moving toward them from multiple directions. They had no mail from home, no reliable news from Germany, no contact with the wider war beyond the scraps of information their captain chose to share with them. What they had was their ship, their training, their captain's evident competence, and the cold professional satisfaction of a mission that was, by any measure, succeeding. But success in commerce raiding is a diminishing return. The more ships you sink, the more urgently your enemies search for you, and the hunters, however slowly, were closing in. There is a particular kind of man who finds himself at war with the war he has been ordered to fight, not against his country, not against his duty, but against the manner in which that duty is carried out, against the casual cruelties that accumulate when men begin treating other men as obstacles rather than human beings. Hans Langsdorff was such a man. He wore his uniform with precision, commanded his ship with authority, and pursued his mission with professional dedication. But somewhere beneath the gold braid and the iron composure, there existed a set of convictions that could not be dissolved by a change of government or the outbreak of hostilities. Those convictions would define everything that happened aboard the Graf Spee, and ultimately, everything that happened to her captain. Langsdorff had come of age as a naval officer during the First World War, and that experience had left marks that no amount of peacetime service could erase. He had seen what modern weapons did to men when the rules of engagement were ignored, when crews were left in burning ships, when the pretense of chivalry gave way entirely to the arithmetic of war. He had also seen the opposite, commanders who maintained order, who treated the defeated with dignity, who seemed to understand that a war conducted without restraint was a war that would leave nothing worth saving on either side. He carried that understanding with him when he took command of the Graf Spee, and he carried it still as he sailed her south into the hunting grounds of the South Atlantic. His crew knew it, his officers knew it, and in time his enemies would know it too. The practice of commerce raiding had its own brutal logic. A vessel identified as carrying supplies to the enemy was, under the laws of war, a legitimate target. The question was never whether to sink her, the question was how. In the early weeks of the conflict, German submarines had already demonstrated one answer: attack without warning, leave survivors to chance, move on. It was efficient. It was ruthless. And it was an approach that Langsdorff refused. Before his guns spoke, his signalmen would send a warning. The targeted ship would be given time to stop, to lower her lifeboats, to get her crew clear of the hull. Only when he was satisfied that men were not trapped below decks would he give the order to open fire. It cost him time. It cost him the element of surprise. But to Langsdorff, it was not a cost. It was a condition of service. What this meant in practice was that the merchants of the South Atlantic came to know the Graf Spee not merely as a predator, but as a particular kind of predator, one that telegraphed its intentions, one that waited, one that, in several documented cases, sent its own sailors across in small boats to assist merchant crews with their evacuation before the killing blow was delivered. This was not softness. Langsdorff maintained absolute control over his ship and complete professionalism in all his actions. But there was a deliberate humanity to his methods that stood in stark contrast to what was unfolding elsewhere in this war, and the men who survived their encounters with him spoke of it clearly afterward when they reached port. Their accounts filtered into British intelligence reports, and those reports painted a portrait of a German captain who seemed almost anomalous, a man who behaved as though the laws of warfare were not suggestions to be weighed against convenience, but obligations to be honored regardless of cost. The prisoners were perhaps the clearest expression of this philosophy. Rather than transferring captured crews to the first available neutral vessel and risking the intelligence they carried reaching British ears too quickly, Langsdorff made the choice to bring many of his prisoners aboard the Graf Spee itself. He housed them, fed them from the ship's own stores, and ensured they were treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, that set of international agreements that governed the treatment of prisoners in wartime, and that, even then, too many commanders treated as optional. His prisoners were not placed under brutal conditions. They were confined, surely, but they were safe and they were cared for. Some accounts suggest Langsdorff spoke with them personally, not for intelligence purposes, but simply as a man who felt a responsibility for those who had fallen into his charge. The Graf Spee, for a period of months, carried within her hull something she had not been designed to carry at all, a kind of floating refuge for the men whose ships she had destroyed. This arrangement had consequences that extended far beyond the moral. Every merchant crew kept aboard the Graf Spee was a merchant crew not reaching port, not filing reports with the Admiralty, not providing the detailed information, course headings, last known positions, descriptions of the raiders' behavior that the British hunting groups so desperately needed. The South Atlantic was a vast and largely empty place, and in the absence of reliable sightings and radio reports, the Royal Navy's task of locating a single vessel became exponentially harder. Langsdorff's decency, whether he intended it or not, served as a form of operational security. His humane treatment of prisoners created an intelligence gap that no amount of radio direction finding could fully bridge. The British hunting groups, ranging across thousands of miles of open ocean, were working with fragments, a smoke trail here, a delayed report there, the occasional intercept of a German transmission that revealed more about discipline than position. But there was another dimension to this, one that operated not in the realm of strategy, but in the realm of Langsdorff's own interior life. The men he kept aboard his ship were reminders, vivid and constant, of what his mission actually meant at the human level. He was not sinking abstractions. He was not destroying cargo manifests and shipping schedules. He was ending the livelihoods and threatening the lives of ordinary men, officers, engineers, deckhands, radio operators, who had gone to sea to do an honest job and found themselves suddenly at the center of a war they had not started and could not escape. Every rescued crew member who paced the confined spaces of the Graf Spee was a living argument against the comfortable distance that most military commanders maintained between their orders and their consequences. Langsdorff had chosen to eliminate that distance, and it affected him. His officers observed a man who performed his duties with complete competence, but who did not celebrate them. There was no triumphalism in Langsdorff's command. When a merchant vessel went down, the sinking was noted in the log with professional precision, not with the kind of satisfaction that some regarded as appropriate. He did not display his achievements as trophies. He moved on to the next task with the methodical focus of a man trying to complete a job he had not entirely made peace with. This was not visible weakness. It would be wrong to describe Langsdorff as tormented in any theatrical sense. But those who knew him well could see that he carried something heavier than most commanders allowed themselves to carry, and that the weight of it accumulated with each vessel that went beneath the cold waters of the South Atlantic. The tension at the heart of Langsdorff's situation was one that the broader history of this war would revisit many times, in many theaters, with many different men. He served a regime whose values were not his own, whose contempt for international law, for human dignity, and for the kind of old-world officers' code he had absorbed during his formation as a naval man, was becoming clearer with every month that passed. He had not made that regime. He had not chosen its ideology. He had sworn an oath, as officers swear oaths, and he was doing what the oath demanded of him. But oaths do not answer moral questions. They only define the territory in which moral questions must be faced. And Langsdorff, sailing south with his prisoners and his principals and his 11-inch guns, was facing them constantly. What made this tension particularly acute was that there was no resolution available to him. He could not refuse his orders without destroying himself and likely endangering his crew. He could not fully embrace those orders without destroying the version of himself that had built a career on the belief that war, however brutal, could be conducted within limits. He occupied a space between those two positions that grew narrower as the campaign continued and as the war around him grew more savage. He treated his prisoners well. He warned his targets. He kept faith with a code that his own nation was abandoning, and he did all of this knowing that none of it would ultimately matter, that the ships he sank were sunk, that the men he killed were dead, and that the kindness he showed to those who survived was a small light held against a very large darkness. The British officers who would eventually face him across the waters of the River Plate did not know all of this. They knew fragments, the intelligence reports, the survivor testimonies, the puzzling picture of a German raider that behaved unlike the enemy they had been told to expect. But they were building a portrait, piece by piece, from the testimonies of the very prisoners whose welfare had so defined Langsdorff's command. In a strange and circular way, his decency was both his most admirable quality and the source of the very intelligence that would help to close the net around him. His humanity left witnesses. His witnesses left records, and those records, transmitted across the South Atlantic through the machinery of British naval intelligence, were slowly assembling the outline of a man and a ship that could not hide forever, no matter how vast the ocean, no matter how carefully he moved through it. The South Atlantic is not a sea. It is a void, stretching from the equator to the frozen approaches of Antarctica, from the eastern shoulder of South America to the sun-baked coastline of West Africa. It covers an expanse that defies easy comprehension, more than 40 million square kilometers of open water, much of it untraveled by warships, most of it unobserved by any human eye. In the autumn of 1939, this vastness was both a fortress and a hunting ground. For the Graf Spee, it was the place where she had been born to operate, a theatre so large that finding a single ship within it was less a matter of naval skill than of fortune, patience, and the slow accumulation of clues. The British knew she was out there. They could feel her presence in the gaps left behind, in the vessels that sailed and never arrived, in the silence on the radio frequencies where merchant captains should have been reporting in. By late November of 1939, the Graf Spee had accounted for 9 merchant vessels. When you add the tonnage together, the steel hulls, the cargo holds, the fuel and food and raw materials they carried, the figure rises past 50,000 tons of Allied shipping erased from the Atlantic ledger. Each of those ships had a name. Each had a crew. Each was part of the fragile supply chain that kept Britain fed, armed, and fighting. Captain Hans Langsdorff had conducted each interception with the careful, almost deliberate precision of a man who understood that he was not simply destroying ships, but demonstrating what a single well-designed raider, operating freely, could accomplish against a maritime empire stretched thin across the globe. The British Admiralty, studying the pattern of losses on their charts in London, understood this too. The numbers alone were troubling. The implications were worse. What made the Graf Spee so difficult to counter was not only her speed or her armament, formidable as both were. It was her range. She had been designed from the keel up for exactly this kind of sustained, solitary campaign, fueled by captured oil where possible, resupplied by the supply ship Altmark operating somewhere in the same vast waters, able to remain at sea for months without returning to a friendly port. This independence was, in strategic terms, her most dangerous quality. A warship that must regularly return to port is a warship that can be predicted, a warship that can sustain herself indefinitely on the open ocean becomes almost spectral, appearing at a merchant lane, striking, and disappearing before any response can be organized. The Graf Spee had mastered this rhythm. She would appear off the coast of West Africa one week, and in the waters south of the Cape Verde Islands the next, leaving the British hunting groups perpetually one calculation behind. The British response, however, was not passive. In London and at naval headquarters across the Atlantic, officers bent over charts and plotted every known sinking, every last radio signal, every rumor passed through neutral shipping companies about a large German warship operating in southern waters. The broad picture was becoming clearer, even if the specific location remained elusive. The Graf Spee was somewhere in the triangle, defined by the South American coast to the west, the African continent to the east, and the southern latitudes where the two great oceans began to blur into each other near the Cape of Good Hope. That triangle encompassed an area so enormous that even a fleet of hunting ships could patrol it for months without crossing the raider's path. The Admiralty divided the task into zones, assigned cruisers and heavier vessels to each, and began the slow, methodical work of narrowing the possible ground. Geography itself became a weapon, or more precisely, the geography of trade routes. The ocean is empty, but commerce is not random. Ships follow predictable lanes determined by wind, current, harbor locations, and the economics of cargo. The waters off the Cape of Good Hope were among the busiest in the southern hemisphere, carrying traffic between Britain's Eastern Empire and the home islands. The River Plate estuary off Uruguay and Argentina was another convergence point, one of South America's most productive agricultural regions, shipping grain and beef and wool across the Atlantic, in a steady, vital stream. Between these two poles, the shipping lanes formed a loosely woven net across the South Atlantic, and it was along the threads of that net that the Graf Spee moved, waiting for targets to present themselves. British commanders, studying the same geography, could identify the most likely hunting grounds. The problem was that identifying a likely area and concentrating enough ships to guarantee an interception were entirely different challenges. The Altmark, the supply ship that kept the Graf Spee at sea, deserves particular attention because without her, the raiders' campaign would have been measured in weeks rather than months. Operating under cover of a neutral-appearing identity on the open ocean, she rendezvoused with the Graf Spee at pre-arranged coordinates. Coordinates changed regularly and communicated through encrypted signals that the British were working furiously to unravel. The Altmark carried not only fuel and provisions but something else of considerable significance: the captured crews from the ships the Graf Spee had sunk. Langsdorff's policy of preserving merchant lives meant that hundreds of British, New Zealand, and other Allied sailors were now living below decks on the Altmark, alive, fed, and entirely invisible to the Royal Navy hunting their captor. This arrangement served Langsdorff's moral instincts, but also complicated the picture for British intelligence, since no survivors were reaching port to describe the Graf Spee's position or condition at the time of their capture. The Indian Ocean entered the equation in early December, when British signals intelligence began to suggest that the German raider had moved east, or might be about to do so. A vessel capable of rounding the Cape of Good Hope could access the Indian Ocean routes, threatening shipping from India, Australia, and the Middle East as well as the Atlantic corridors. This possibility forced the Admiralty to split its attention, deploying hunting groups that might have been concentrated in the South Atlantic into the broader strategic picture. Force H, Force K, Force G. The British numbered their hunting squadrons and scattered them across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open water, each one too weak to guarantee victory against the Graf Spee alone if they found her, each one necessary to cover the staggering geography of the hunt. It was a strategic problem without a clean solution, and the men in London knew it. Weather played its own part in this stage of the campaign, as it always does in the southern oceans. The South Atlantic below the 30th parallel is not a gentle sea. Swells that have been building across uninterrupted ocean for thousands of kilometers arrive with a slow, massive authority that sets even large warships rolling deeply in their troughs. Visibility can collapse in hours as squalls blow through, reducing the horizon from a clear 30 kilometers to a few hundred meters of driving rain and white water. For the Graf Spee, these conditions were both a hazard and a form of cover. A ship invisible in heavy weather is a ship that cannot be intercepted, and Langsdorff knew how to use the South Atlantic's moods to mask his movements. For the British hunting groups, the same weather meant lost days at sea without sightings, men exhausted by constant watchkeeping in rough conditions, and fuel consumption that shortened their operational endurance. Intelligence, meanwhile, was flowing in both directions, imperfectly, incompletely, and always with a lag that could render it useless by the time it reached the hands that needed it. The British had broken some of the lower-level German naval codes, but high-grade encrypted traffic remained opaque. What they could read were the merchant distress signals, the brief, compressed radio calls that a ship managed to transmit before the Graf Spee's crew could jam or prevent them. These signals gave positions, but positions that were hours or days old by the time the hunting groups received orders to respond. The raider was always gone before anyone arrived. Yet each signal added another data point to the chart in London, another constraint on the possible territory where the Graf Spee might next appear, another piece of a picture that was slowly, grudgingly becoming legible. Commodore Henry Harwood, commanding the British South Atlantic Squadron from his flagship, was among those reading that picture with particular intensity. He had fewer ships than he wanted, and a larger area than any reasonable person could effectively patrol. But he had something the broader Admiralty Command lacked: a specific, studied focus on the River Plate region and the shipping that passed through it. Harwood had been thinking about the Graf Spee for weeks, mapping her probable course against the trade routes she had already attacked, calculating where a commander in Langsdorff's position would logically turn next. The River Plate kept returning to the center of his analysis. The estuary was rich with targets. It lay at a junction of major shipping lanes, and it was far from any British naval base, which meant that for a raider who wished to strike hard and disappear before a response could be mounted, it represented exactly the kind of opportunity that the Graf Spee's whole campaign had been built to exploit. What neither Harwood nor anyone else in the hunting groups could know was that December was already decided, in a sense. The forces that would eventually bring the Graf Spee to battle were already in motion, not because of any single brilliant stroke of intelligence or any dramatic failure of German security, but because the logic of the campaign itself had begun to close around Langsdorff's options like a slow tide coming in. A raider can only operate freely for so long before the sheer accumulated weight of response, hunting groups, rerouted convoys, tightened communications, revised patrol patterns, begins to compress the space available to her. The South Atlantic was growing smaller, not in any physical sense, but in the strategic sense that mattered. The geometry of the hunt was tightening, and December 1939 was the month in which all the converging lines would finally meet. The ocean that covered the southern reaches of the Atlantic in 1939 was not truly empty. Every ship that sailed it left traces, radio signals cast into the ether, merchant reports filed through naval channels, patterns of commercial shipping that moved with the regularity of tides. To a man trained in the mathematics of naval strategy, these traces formed a language. Commodore Henry Harwood, commanding the British South Atlantic Squadron from his flagship the Cumberland, spoke that language fluently. He was a career officer who had served with distinction in the First World War, a man accustomed to making decisions with incomplete information in vast and hostile spaces. By late 1939, as the Graf Spee continued her rampage across the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans, Harwood found himself engaged in an act of strategic deduction that would determine not only the fates of ships and men, but the course of the war's opening months. He did not have perfect information. No admiral ever does. What he possessed instead was intelligence, intuition, and the willingness to risk everything on a single calculation. The hunt for the Graf Spee had consumed vast resources across multiple oceans. The British Admiralty had deployed hunting groups with a combination of heavy and light cruisers, battle cruisers, and armed merchant cruisers across every conceivable raiding route. Some squadrons patrolled the Cape of Good Hope passage. Others watched the Indian Ocean approaches, the waters where merchant convoys moved between Britain and the Far East, carrying supplies that were not merely commercial cargo, but sinews of war. Still more ships maintained vigilance across the mid-Atlantic, ready to intercept if the German raider turned northward toward the European shipping lanes or toward the supply routes that fed Britain herself. It was a dispersal of force, born of necessity, but fraught with risk. Each hunting group was relatively weak, vulnerable to the Graf Spee if they encountered her without support. Yet to concentrate all available ships in a single location would leave vast stretches of ocean undefended and permit the raider to strike where no opposition awaited. Harwood understood this tension intimately. His own squadron in the South Atlantic consisted of only 3 cruisers: the Exeter, a heavy cruiser with considerably more firepower than her lighter companions, and the Ajax and Achilles, both light cruisers armed with 6-inch guns. Against the Graf Spee's 11-inch main battery, they would be outgunned. Against her armor and speed, they would struggle. Yet these were the forces available to him, and with them he had to work. The key to Harwood's strategic thinking lay not in matching firepower, but in predicting movement. The Graf Spee had sunk 9 merchant vessels by December 1939, each loss a data point in a vast equation. Where had she struck? When? What was the pattern of her attacks? Harwood studied the reports with the attention of a cryptographer breaking an enemy code. The German raider appeared to be following the major shipping routes around the African continent, attacking merchant vessels as they passed through specific choke points in the South Atlantic. But more significantly, the frequency and timing of her attacks suggested something more specific. She was not simply ranging across random territories, but seemed to be moving with purpose toward a particular region. The mouth of the River Plate estuary, where the great river that drained the interior of South America met the Atlantic, had become a vital concentration point for shipping. Vessels bound for the ports of Buenos Aires and Montevideo in Argentina and Uruguay converged in this area, and from there flowed the exports of South America, agricultural products, minerals, and other commodities vital to the British war effort. A raider positioned here could inflict enormous damage. To Harwood's mind, this was where the Graf Spee would inevitably appear. It was not certainty, it was probability calculated from imperfect data. It was the kind of educated guess that naval command required, the kind that could be catastrophically wrong. What gave Harwood's hypothesis particular weight was not merely commercial logic, but the operational reality facing the German ship. The Graf Spee had been at sea for months, far from any friendly port where she could obtain fuel, ammunition, or provisions. German surface raiders depended on rendezvous with supply ships, a complex and dangerous process that required precise coordination in empty oceans. Montevideo and Buenos Aires, as neutral ports in Uruguay and Argentina, represented the only places in the South Atlantic where the German ship could potentially resupply without engaging in direct combat. The two nations maintained official neutrality in the conflict, though Argentina harbored considerable sympathy for Germany and had German expatriate communities. More practically, these ports lay within reach of German supply vessels, and they represented the logical destination for a raider whose fuel tanks were depleting and whose crew needed shore leave and maintenance work. Harwood reasoned that sooner or later the Graf Spee would have to approach the River Plate. It was not a matter of if, but when, and he intended to be waiting. The positioning of his 3 cruisers required both tactical skill and a measure of cold calculation about acceptable losses. Harwood could not know exactly where or when the Graf Spee would appear. He could only establish a patrol zone and hope his ships would detect her before she detected them. The Exeter he stationed to cover the outer approaches to the River Plate, operating further from the coast where she could see approaching vessels across greater distances. The Ajax and Achilles, being faster and more maneuverable, he held in reserve closer to the estuary mouth, ready to move rapidly to support the Exeter if contact was made. This disposition meant that the Exeter, if she encountered the German raider first, would face a significant period of time fighting alone before reinforcement could arrive. Harwood was aware of this vulnerability. He accepted it as the price of his strategy. The Exeter was not a capital ship, not a battleship that could stand alone against a cruiser of the Graf Spee's class. But she was the largest gun platform available to him, and her 11-inch guns, though fewer in number than the German ship's artillery, could at least strike with comparable weight. If she could hold the Graf Spee's attention long enough for Ajax and Achilles to maneuver into position, the combined fire of 3 British ships might achieve what none could accomplish alone. Harwood's gamble was not unique in naval history, but it represented a particular British tradition of accepting tactical risk in exchange for strategic advantage. The Royal Navy had built an empire not through overwhelming force at every point, but through clever positioning, superior seamanship, and the willingness of individual captains and commanders to accept danger on behalf of larger objectives. Harwood embodied this tradition. He was not a man given to recklessness, but neither was he paralyzed by caution. He understood that in war, inaction carried its own costs. If he did nothing, and the Graf Spee reached the River Plate unimpeded, she would ravage merchant shipping with virtual impunity. The British people would suffer loss of supplies and lives. The morale benefit of remaining neutral and passive would accrue entirely to the enemy. But if he committed his limited forces to a single location based on his analysis, and if that analysis proved correct, he could achieve a victory that would reverberate throughout the naval war. The stakes of his decision were enormous, but they were also hidden beneath layers of routine naval operations and the calm professional demeanour that command required. The British Naval Officer Corps in 1939 had been shaped by the experience of the First World War, fought 2 decades earlier. Many of Harwood's contemporaries had served in that earlier conflict, had witnessed the massive battleship engagements at Jutland, and had absorbed the lessons, real and imagined, from that costly struggle. They understood that naval warfare was being transformed by new technologies. Radar in its infancy, aircraft beginning to challenge surface ship dominance, submarine threats growing more acute. Yet they also held fast to older traditions of seamanship, gunnery, and the principles of naval warfare that had been refined across centuries of maritime conflict. Harwood combined both perspectives. He recognized that finding a single ship in a vast ocean was extraordinarily difficult, but he trusted in the methods by which navies had always located enemies: radio direction finding of wireless signals, reports from merchant vessels, analysis of known shipping patterns, and the educated guesses of experienced officers who had spent years mastering the mathematics of naval strategy. He was not relying on luck, though luck would surely play a role. He was relying on method, on the accumulated experience of the Royal Navy, and on his own judgment. The 3 British cruisers took up their stations in the waters off the River Plate as November faded into December. The crews of these ships did not know what Harwood had calculated or why they were positioned where they were. Officers understood the general strategic situation. The Graf Spee was loose, merchant shipping was threatened, and their task was to hunt. The ordinary sailors and junior officers knew even less, and in the traditions of naval service, they accepted their orders without question. The Cumberland, Harwood's flagship, was not positioned at the River Plate, but instead operated further north, coordinating the movements of other British ships across the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. From there, Harwood maintained radio contact with his subordinate commanders and received reports of merchant ship sinkings and radio intercepts. It was from this position that he continued to refine his understanding of where the Graf Spee was moving and when she might appear. He could not force the German ship toward the River Plate. He could only position his forces where he believed she would come, and hope that his analysis proved sound. The psychological burden of this kind of command decision was substantial, though it manifested in ways that were rarely discussed in official dispatches or personal correspondence. Harwood carried the knowledge that if his calculation was wrong, his ships might be positioned in empty ocean while the Graf Spee struck elsewhere. He carried the knowledge that if his analysis was correct, but his timing was off by hours or days, the German ship might slip past his cruisers in darkness or fog. He carried the knowledge that even if contact was made, the engagement might go badly, that his crews might suffer casualties, that ships might be sunk. All of this was standard to naval command in wartime, yet it weighed nonetheless. A commander who did not feel the weight of such decisions was either incapable of understanding their magnitude or was emotionally damaged in ways that made him unfit for responsibility over other men's lives. Harwood, by all contemporary accounts, was neither. He was a conscientious officer who understood exactly what he was asking his men to accomplish and what it might cost them. The positioning itself required coordination with other British naval elements, with the Admiralty in London, and with the diplomatic representatives of Britain in South America. Naval operations could not occur in a vacuum, isolated from political and diplomatic considerations. Uruguay and Argentina were neutral nations, and Britain had interests in maintaining reasonable relations with them despite the war. The presence of British warships in their territorial waters or patrolling their coasts had to be conducted with sufficient discretion that the neutral governments could pretend ignorance of what was happening, could maintain their official neutrality while tacitly permitting British operations. This created a complex diplomatic dance that ran parallel to the military operations. Harwood's ships had to be positioned to intercept the Graf Spee, but they also had to operate in ways that did not overtly violate Uruguayan and Argentine sovereignty. This was not a constraint that prevented his plan, but it was a constraint that shaped how it could be executed. Naval operations, even in wartime, did not exist entirely outside the realm of law and diplomacy. As December arrived, the waiting game began in earnest. Harwood's 3 cruisers settled into their patrol patterns, their crews rotating through watches and maintenance routines, their officers studying the sea and sky for signs of the enemy, radio direction finding equipment, a relatively new technology, monitored the airwaves for transmissions that might indicate the Graf Spee's position. Merchant ship reports came in through naval intelligence channels, each one adding another data point to the strategic picture. The German raider continued to move toward the south and west, her operations continuing but now seeming to shift in the direction Harwood had predicted. The Commodore watched and waited, having committed his forces to their positions and having little choice but to trust in his analysis. He had made his gamble. He had distributed his limited forces across the ocean based on a prediction about enemy movement. He had accepted the risk that his 3 cruisers would face a more heavily armed opponent if contact was made. He was no longer in control of the immediate outcome. That would be determined by his subordinate commanders, by the courage of their crews, and by the brutal mathematics of naval warfare, where skill and luck combined in ways no pre-war planning could fully anticipate. All that remained was to wait for dawn on the 13th of December, when lookouts would report smoke on the horizon, and Harwood's calculated gamble would be transformed into violent reality. The South Atlantic in December brings a strange inversion to those accustomed to northern seasons. While Europe shivers in deep winter, the waters off the coast of South America are entering summer, though the term brings no comfort to men confined aboard metal ships far from home. The days grow longer, the sun climbs higher, and the wind shifts in patterns that only the oldest sailors can read with confidence. Yet for the British crews patrolling these distant waters, the arrival of December in 1939 meant something far more significant than the turning of a calendar page. It meant that their watch had entered a new phase. The waiting had begun in earnest. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic, a German raider was moving toward them. Commodore Henry Harwood had staked everything on that conviction: his ships, his reputation, and the lives of every man under his command. The Exeter, under Captain Frank Bell, maintained her station in the approaches to the River Plate, with a crew grown increasingly alert and increasingly exhausted. She was the oldest of the three cruisers, built in the previous decade, and her heavy guns were her only advantage in a sea that showed no mercy to the unprepared. The men who served aboard her had settled into a routine that was both numbing and terrifying, hour after hour of nothing, punctuated by moments of heightened vigilance when lookouts spotted distant smoke or a ship on the horizon that proved to be a neutral merchant vessel or another British patrol. The machinery never stopped running. The engines rumbled constantly, consuming fuel at rates that Harwood could not afford to waste, yet could not afford to conserve either. Every mile travelled in search of the Graf Spee was a mile that brought the ship closer to empty tanks and the ignominy of being towed back to port. The men slept in short shifts, wrapped in damp clothing that never fully dried in the humid salt air, their minds half present even when their bodies demanded rest. Aboard the Ajax and Achilles, the British light cruisers under the command of Captain William Woodhouse and Captain William Summerford respectively, the psychological weight manifested differently but no less heavily. These were faster ships, more nimble, better suited to the hunting mission that Harwood had assigned them. Yet speed meant nothing without fuel, and fuel was the currency that every captain watched with the intensity of a miser guarding gold. The crews of these ships were younger on average than those of the Exeter, men who had joined the Navy expecting years of training and routine, only to find themselves 6 weeks into a war that felt utterly unreal in its remoteness. Argentina was a neutral country. Uruguay was a neutral country. The coastlines around them hosted towns and cities where life continued as though the war were happening on another planet. Yet Harwood's men knew that somewhere beyond their horizon, a ship was hunting them as intently as they hunted it. The knowledge created a psychological tension that grew worse with each passing day, not better. Routine could comfort when the cause was mundane. Routine created paranoia when the stakes involved death. The South Atlantic at that time of year was entering the period of maximum unpredictability. Summer storms could develop with shocking speed, rising from apparent calm to tempestuous fury within hours. The currents that flowed past the estuary of the River Plate brought cold water from the south, mixing with warmer flows from the north, creating conditions where visibility could shift from crystalline to nearly opaque in moments. Radio direction finding, the new technology that Harwood relied upon for intelligence about the raiders' position, became unreliable in these conditions. The German ship knew how to maintain radio silence effectively. She had travelled for months across 2 oceans without being pinned down precisely. Every merchant captain's report that came through was already hours or days old by the time it reached the British Commodore. The intelligence that Harwood used to position his ships was educated guessing built upon accumulated scraps of information, wireless intercepts from neutral sources, and the pattern of merchant ship losses. He had studied the routes taken by the raiders from the previous war, considered the currents and weather patterns, and made a calculation that bordered on prophecy. Whether his calculation would prove correct remained unknown. The supply situation grew increasingly threadbare as December progressed deeper into its calendar. Fresh water was rationed more strictly than any other commodity, for in these latitudes the evaporation from the metal decks was prodigious, and a ship far from port could not afford to waste what little they carried. The food stores, while adequate in quantity, grew monotonous beyond measure. Corned beef and hardtack and dried biscuits that had been packed before summer in the United Kingdom had taken on a staleness that seemed to accumulate like a patina of disappointment. The men learned to eat without tasting, to consume without satisfaction. The cooks and stewards did what they could with the materials available, but no amount of effort could transform basic military provisions into something that sustained the spirit as well as the body. Morale wavered. There were men aboard these ships who had volunteered enthusiastically, who had joined the Navy believing themselves part of a great cause. After weeks of searching the empty ocean, of standing watch in the darkness with nothing to show for their vigilance, that enthusiasm began to curdle into something resembling resentment. Harwood understood the psychology of his crews as well as any senior officer in the Royal Navy. He knew that men could maintain peak alertness for only so long before exhaustion began to dull their senses. He knew that hope deferred becomes indistinguishable from hopelessness, yet he could not afford to relax his watch. He could not allow his ships to settle into truly comfortable stations where they might be caught unprepared. The Commodore had made his wager, and now he had to live within the confines of that bet. He positioned the Exeter to the north and west, in the approaches to the river itself, where she would be the first to make contact if the Graf Spee approached from the south. The Ajax and Achilles he stationed further south and east, in positions from which they could converge rapidly on the Exeter if battle was joined. The geometry of his deployment was not perfect, no deployment at sea ever was, but it was the product of careful calculation. If the raider appeared, Harwood had designed his formation to bring maximum force to bear as quickly as possible. If the raider did not appear, he would have to endure the knowledge that his guess had been wrong, that the Graf Spee was somewhere else entirely, and that the blame for any subsequent sinkings of British merchantmen would rest upon his shoulders. The days were long in that waiting period, made longer by the peculiar character of summer darkness in the South Atlantic. The sun rose early and set late, creating extended periods of twilight where the horizon dissolved into shadow but never fully retreated into night. This was the hardest time for lookouts, neither fully dark nor fully light, but suspended in a grey zone, where tired eyes struggled to distinguish between genuine contacts and the tricks played by exhaustion and the imagination. The signalmen worked their flags and blinker lights constantly, maintaining communication between the three British ships while preserving radio silence as much as possible. In an age before instant electronic communication, this flag signaling represented the only truly secure method of shipboard conversation. The signals and answers flew back and forth, fuel status, readiness reports, confirmation that all stations remained alert and all guns manned. Harwood spent his time reviewing the intelligence summaries that arrived via wireless from the naval stations on the African coast and in India, analyzing the reports from merchant captains who had encountered the raider or seen her smoke on the horizon, checking and rechecking the calculations that led him to believe the Plate estuary was where the Graf Spee must eventually appear. The German raider, meanwhile, was in fact approaching the very waters where Harwood had positioned his ships. Captain Hans Langsdorff had maintained his course and speed with the precision of a man following a predetermined script. He had raided the shipping lanes with methodical efficiency. Each prize added to his tally, and each successful sinking confirming his assessment of his ship's capabilities. Yet even Langsdorff was beginning to feel the weight of extended independent operations. His crew, though highly trained and well motivated, had been at sea for months without shore leave or respite. The constant vigilance required to evade British hunting groups had created its own psychological burden. Langsdorff maintained meticulous records of every ship he had sunk, every prisoner he had taken aboard temporarily before transferring them to neutral vessels, every action taken in accordance with his understanding of naval honor and the Geneva Convention. These records were both his pride and his potential liability. They documented his adherence to the rules of war, but they also would provide evidence of his actions to whoever eventually brought him to account. Unlike some German naval officers, Langsdorff was not a committed Nazi. He was a career officer who had served through the First World War and risen through the ranks of the Reichsmarine on the basis of competence and reputation. His decision to approach the River Plate was based purely on tactical and operational considerations. The waters around the estuary were known to be heavily traveled by merchant shipping, bound for and from Buenos Aires. The raid would be profitable in terms of tonnage sunk and supplies captured. That he was sailing directly toward 3 British warships was something he did not and could not know. The British ships maintained strict radio silence. No wireless signals betrayed their presence. The merchant reports that had guided Harwood's positioning came from neutral observers, from crew members of ships the raider had attacked, and from scattered intelligence reports gathered through channels that the German Navy could not fully penetrate or predict. Langsdorff operated on the assumption that the British forces in the South Atlantic were scattered and unprepared, that they would be concentrated further north around the more profitable shipping lanes, or dispersed across too great a distance to intercept a single raider moving at deliberate speed. He did not know about Harwood's gamble. He did not know that 3 British cruisers were waiting, their crews alert and ready, their guns manned and their engines running. The symmetry was almost perfect, a hunter approaching hunters who had prepared an ambush, both parties moving toward the same point in the vast ocean with no awareness of what awaited them on the other side of the horizon. As the second week of December began its slow passage toward the third, the crews of the Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter existed in a state of suspended animation between hope and despair. The probability that Harwood's deduction was correct seemed to diminish with each day that passed without contact. Surely, the men reasoned, if the raider were coming, she would have appeared by now. Surely they would have received some confirmation that their extended patrol was justified, that the fuel they had burned and the supplies they had consumed were in service of a genuine threat rather than a phantom born from a Commodore's educated guess. The morale was fragile, maintained primarily by discipline and the confidence that men place in their officers when no other certainty remains. Harwood himself would later record that he had begun to doubt whether his calculation was correct, whether the Graf Spee would truly appear in the waters where he had placed his ships. Yet he did not waver in his commitment to the position. He had made his decision based on the intelligence available, the best reasoning at his command, and a fundamental understanding of how a naval raider must eventually resupply and how the geography of the South Atlantic constrained the options available to such a ship. The waiting continued. The patrol continued. The vigil stretched on into the darkness of coming dawn. The nights in December are short in the South Atlantic, but they feel long to men standing watch. The crew of the Exeter maintained their station through those nights with a professionalism that carried them forward even as hope ebbed and doubt crept in. On the bridge, the officers monitored the horizon with binoculars and the naked eye, studying the patterns of wind and water, maintaining awareness of the position relative to the other British ships. In the engine rooms, the engineers kept the massive engines running, monitoring pressure gauges and temperature readings, prepared to accelerate or maneuver the ship instantly if the order came. In the gun turrets, the crews remained at their stations during periods of high alert, then rotated through periods of rest that were interrupted frequently by drills and readiness checks. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for weeks. The preparation was complete and yet insufficient, because readiness without action becomes indistinguishable from futility. Harwood's gamble had been sound in its reasoning and daring in its execution. Now it had to be validated by the appearance of the ship that had haunted the dreams and calculations of every officer and sailor in the British South Atlantic Squadron. The waiting game would soon end. Neither side knew that the moment of contact was measured in hours rather than days or weeks, that the horizon that seemed so empty would soon give up its secrets, that the long preparation was about to transform into brief, terrible, and glorious action. The sun rose over the South Atlantic as it had for millions of years, indifferent to the intentions of men and the machinery they had built. It rose on an ocean that held one German raider and 3 British cruisers, none fully aware of the other's exact position, all moving toward a convergence point that had been predicted by calculation and luck and the deep patterns of naval warfare. The morning of the 13th of December, 1939, broke clear and bright over the waters off the River Plate. The visibility was good, better than it had been in days. The wind was moderate. The sea state was manageable. Every condition that Harwood could have hoped for had aligned. Yet he did not know, as his ships began their morning routines, that this particular dawn would be the one. The waiting was over, though it would take another few hours before anyone understood that fact. The hunters and the hunted were about to meet, and the course of the entire war in the South Atlantic was about to be written in the space of 2 hours of violent action and the choices that would follow. In the darkness of early morning, on the 13th of December 1939, the South Atlantic remained largely indifferent to human ambition. The waters off the mouth of the River Plate were cold and grey, churned by winter swells that rolled across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Above this grey expanse, the sky held that peculiar quality of the pre-dawn hours, not quite black, not yet illuminated, existing in a state of suspension between night and the approaching day. The 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax and Achilles, maintained their patrol stations in formation, their crews alert, but tired from weeks of searching an empty ocean. Below decks, men moved through the metal corridors of their ships with the routine movements of those who have performed the same tasks so many times that muscle memory has replaced conscious thought. The radio operators sat before their dials, listening to the static-filled void. The gunners remained at their stations, surrounded by ammunition and machinery, waiting for an order that might never come. This was the reality of naval warfare in 1939, long periods of monotony, punctuated by moments of absolute terror and clarity. Aboard the Exeter, under the command of Captain Frederick John Bell, the morning watch was settling into the usual rhythms of shipboard life. The men had grown accustomed to the cold, to the endless scanning of the horizon, to the knowledge that somewhere out there, a German commerce raider was hunting merchant vessels with ruthless efficiency. They did not know if the Graf Spee was close or thousands of kilometers distant. The ocean is vast beyond human comprehension, larger than all the land on Earth combined, and finding a single ship within it is a task that demands equal parts intelligence, luck, and determination. But Commodore Harwood's analysis had been sound, his reasoning based on careful study of merchant ship routes and the predictable behavior of a raider who must eventually return to the rich hunting grounds around the River Plate. The 3 British cruisers had been positioned not with certainty, but with hope, the hope that their commander had read the mind of his opponent correctly. As the sun approached the eastern horizon, painting the underside of the clouds with shades of orange and red, the first stirrings of movement came from the British ships. Men emerged from below to take up their morning stations. Boilers rumbled as engines were brought to a state of readiness. The lookouts, standing on their platforms high above the deck, swept their binoculars across the still dark waters ahead. It was one of these lookouts, scanning the horizon with the methodical patience that months of searching had instilled in him, who first caught sight of the smoke. It appeared as a thin column on the horizon to the northwest, rising from the sea like a signal written in dark ink against the lightening sky. The lookout called out, and the report spread through the ships with the speed of electricity through copper wire. After weeks of uncertainty, the waiting was over. The hunt had ended. The battle was about to begin. Aboard the German commerce raider, the morning had dawned with no premonition of catastrophe. The Graf Spee, a ship of 8,860 metric tons, moved through the waters with the confidence of a predator that has never encountered a genuine threat. Captain Hans Langsdorff, standing on the bridge in the grey light of morning, was a man of 52 years, a career naval officer who had served in the First World War and carried with him the bearing of a Prussian officer steeped in tradition and duty. He had spent nearly 3 months on this raiding cruise, sinking merchant vessels and operating far from any possibility of resupply or reinforcement from German ports. His ship carried 11-inch guns capable of delivering devastating fire at ranges that made her superior to any light cruiser. Against the battleships and heavy cruisers that the British possessed, the Graf Spee would be vulnerable, but such ships were meant to hunt merchant convoys, not engage warships. The sea ahead appeared empty, as it had appeared empty for weeks. There was no warning, no hint that the fundamental nature of his mission was about to change. The smoke on the horizon resolved itself gradually into shapes, the hulls and superstructures of 3 ships, moving in formation toward the German raider. For a moment, there was confusion aboard the Graf Spee, as her crew attempted to identify the approaching vessels through the murk of the morning. When the truth became clear that these were not merchant ships but Royal Navy cruisers, the moment of realization was profound and absolute. Captain Langsdorff faced a choice that had never confronted him during his months of raiding undefended merchant vessels. He could run, using the superior speed of the Graf Spee to break away and attempt to reach the safety of neutral ports or German-controlled waters. He could fight, engaging the 3 British cruisers in combat that might result in victory but was far more likely to result in the destruction of his ship. He could attempt to slip past them, heading further out to sea and hoping to break through their line. Each choice carried with it the weight of consequence, for his crew, for his ship, for the Reich that had built him and sent him to war. From the bridge of the Exeter, Commodore Henry Harwood could see his opponent clearly now, the grey form of the German raider rising from the water ahead. This was the moment toward which all his planning had been directed, all his analysis and careful positioning of his 3 ships. He knew, as surely as any naval commander could know, that his cruisers were outgunned in terms of raw firepower. The Graf Spee's 11-inch guns could strike at ranges where the Exeter's 8-inch guns would be less effective, where the Ajax and Achilles' 6-inch guns would struggle to inflict serious damage. But Harwood possessed advantages of a different kind. He had 3 ships to the Germans' 1. He had the psychological initiative. His opponent was surprised, emerging from months of commerce raiding into an unexpected engagement. He had training and tactics refined through generations of British naval tradition. And he had something less tangible, but equally important. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The British Admiralty had sent 3 ships to the South Atlantic to find this raider. If they failed, the Graf Spee would continue her depredations. If they succeeded, even at great cost, they had accomplished their mission. Langsdorff made his decision with the speed that command demands. He would fight, at least initially. To run immediately would be to concede superiority without contest. The German tradition in naval warfare held that a captain should meet his opponent with aggression, that defense was less honorable than attack. His guns began to train toward the approaching British ships, the crews below decks, receiving orders through the ship's telephone system, moved with practiced efficiency to the battle stations. The Graf Spee, which had spent months moving unopposed across the world's oceans, was about to learn what it meant to face organized resistance. The moment of transition was startlingly fast, from the mundane routine of a raider's patrol to the violent reality of naval warfare. One moment, the sea was a vast emptiness. The next, it had become a battlefield. The distance between the two sides closed with mathematical precision, measured in diminishing kilometers and measured also in the increasing tempo of human activity aboard each ship. The lookouts continued to call out distances and bearings. The gun crews made final adjustments to their equipment. The damage control parties below decks, men who would never see the battle unfold, but who would be responsible for keeping their ship afloat should she be struck, took up their positions with the grim knowledge that their work might be futile. Radio operators stood ready to relay commands. Signalmen prepared to send and receive orders from other ships. The air itself seemed to change, becoming heavier, charged with expectation. To those who had never been in battle before, the sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of fear and exhilaration so intense that some men later could not clearly remember the passage of time. To those who had experienced combat, this feeling of walking toward the unknown while moving at 20 knots through open water was familiar but no less disturbing. Harwood, observing his opponent and reading her movements like a hunter reading the behavior of dangerous prey, made his own crucial decision. He would not attempt to stand off at long range where the Graf Spee's superior firepower would favor her. Instead, he would close the distance, bringing his ships into waters where the Germans' advantages would be diminished, and where numbers would matter more than raw gunpowder. This decision violated certain principles of naval tactics, as understood by some of his contemporaries. Some commanders might have chosen to maintain range, to stand off and trade salvos at distances where accuracy becomes as much a matter of luck as skill. But Harwood understood that this was not a battle between equals, and in such contests, the weaker side must be willing to accept greater risks in order to have any chance of victory. He ordered the Exeter to head directly toward the German raider, positioning her to bring her guns to bear while offering a smaller target to the enemy's fire. The moment when the first gun fired was the moment when everything changed. In the grey light of morning, with the sun still below the horizon, though its presence was felt in the spreading illumination of the sky, the Battle of the River Plate began. No declaration had preceded this moment. No formal ceremony marked the transition from peace, or rather, from commerce raiding to open warfare. There was only the terrible mathematics of naval gunnery, the translation of steel and explosives into human death and destruction. The British ships accelerated, increasing their speed to close the distance, their engines working at maximum capacity to drive them forward. The Graf Spee's guns opened fire in return, and the ocean around the Exeter erupted into chaos as shells fell nearby, sending up pillars of water and spray that climbed toward the sky. The reality of warfare, which had been theoretical to most of these men, became suddenly and horribly concrete. The moment had been inevitable from the instant that the Graf Spee's lookouts spotted the British smoke. The months of hunting, the thousands of kilometers of open ocean, the careful deployment of Harwood's ships, all of it had been building toward this single dawn when 3 cruisers would attempt to destroy an armored raider far from any supporting force or resupply. Neither Langsdorff nor Harwood could have predicted with certainty what would unfold in the hours ahead, but both men understood, as the first salvos were exchanged and the ships maneuvered in the grey morning light, that the fundamental nature of their war had shifted. The hunt was over. The hunters and the hunted had finally come face to face, and whatever occurred in the hours ahead, whatever damage was inflicted, whatever casualties were sustained, this moment would be remembered. The smoke rising from the guns of 4 ships, the shells screaming through the morning air, the crews manning their stations knowing that death was a very real possibility. These were the things that would remain in the memories of those who survived, that would echo through naval histories and technical studies of gunnery and tactics. The hunting game had become a battle, and on the 13th of December 1939, as dawn broke over the River Plate, that battle was truly joined. The morning light that broke across the South Atlantic on the 13th of December painted the horizon in shades of grey and pale orange, casting long shadows across the water. Aboard the British cruiser Ajax, lookouts had spotted the smoke, that telltale smudge rising from beyond the curve of the sea, where only empty water should exist. Within moments, the signal went racing through the fleet. Within moments, Commodore Henry Harwood, a man who had spent weeks studying charts and calculating probabilities in the quiet of his cabin, understood that the waiting was over. The Graf Spee had appeared exactly where his reasoning had placed her, but prediction is not the same as preparation, and Harwood now faced a choice that would define not just this battle, but the reputations of 3 ships and the lives of 900 men. He had to decide whether to fight or withdraw. He had seconds to make it. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. On paper, Harwood's force was outmatched. The Graf Spee carried 2 11-inch guns in her forward turret, guns that fired shells weighing more than half a ton and could punch through armor plate at ranges where Harwood's ships could barely see their target. The Exeter, his most powerful vessel, carried 8-inch guns, smaller, yes, but still formidable. Ajax and Achilles, the 2 light cruisers, carried 6-inch guns that were designed for fleet work, for supporting battleships, not for standing toe-to-toe with an armoured cruiser. The disparity in tonnage was equally stark. The Graf Spee displaced more than 10,000 tons and was built specifically to absorb punishment. The 3 British ships combined barely exceeded that weight, and their hulls were thinner, their armour lighter. A sailor looking at the odds might have expected Harwood to turn away, to preserve his force and wait for reinforcements from the north. A commodore sitting in a comfortable chair might have considered that option. But Harwood was neither safe nor comfortable. He was at sea, in command, with the enemy in sight and no guarantee that a second opportunity would ever come. What followed was an act of calculated audacity that betrayed a profound understanding of naval warfare. Harwood did not order a retreat. He ordered an attack, not a cautious probing action, not a delaying maneuver, but an immediate, aggressive assault. His reasoning was born from hard experience and sharper thinking. If he could surprise Langsdorff and force the Graf Spee to fight a battle of movement rather than positioning, the enemy commander could not take full advantage of his superior firepower. Langsdorff's guns, so devastating at long range, required time and space to be brought to bear effectively. They required the enemy to be predictable, to hold position or move in the expected manner. If Harwood's ships attacked with speed and aggression, if they forced Langsdorff into a melee where the German captain had to react rather than choose, then perhaps, just perhaps, the British could negate the armoured cruiser's advantage. It was a gamble born of desperation and brilliance in equal measure, and Harwood was not a man given to hesitation once his mind was set. He flashed his orders through the squadron. The Exeter would charge directly at the Graf Spee, engaging with her 8-inch guns at point-blank range if necessary. Ajax and Achilles would sweep to the right and left, attempting to encircle the enemy and force her attention to divide among 3 separate threats. The Exeter responded to her orders as if she had been waiting all her life for this moment. Under the command of Captain Frederick Bell, a steady officer who understood his ship and trusted his gunnery crews, she turned toward the smoke with the kind of determination that came from months of hunting. Her captain and her crew had been training for this, discussing scenarios in the cramped spaces below deck, running through calculations during long hours at sea. Now theory became action. The distance between the British cruisers and the Graf Spee closed rapidly as both sides accelerated toward each other. The sea churned beneath their hulls as they cut through the grey waters, their crews moving with the precision of men who had drilled for countless hours. Gun crews stood at their stations, ammunition handlers feeding shells into the breaches, fire control officers adjusting their calculations, captains gripping the railings and watching the enemy through binoculars. The Exeter was the smallest of Harwood's 3 ships, but she was also the one carrying the heaviest guns, and that made her invaluable. She was also, therefore, the one Langsdorff's gunners would most want to destroy. The Graf Spee's crew had also seen the British ships on the horizon, and they had also understood the meaning of that sighting. Captain Langsdorff, standing on the bridge with his officers around him, faced his own decision in mirror image to Harwood's. The German captain could see 3 British cruisers bearing down upon him, and he could calculate as clearly as Harwood could that the oncoming vessels were inferior in firepower. But he also knew that his ship had travelled thousands of kilometres from home without resupply, that his engines were not new, that his fuel reserves were not unlimited. He knew that if he could damage or destroy the 3 British ships approaching him, he would have the freedom to manoeuvre, to escape, to return to friendly waters. If he refused the battle, if he turned and ran, would the British pursuit continue? How long could they maintain it? These were questions that had no certain answers, only calculations made in the face of incomplete knowledge. Langsdorff made his choice. He would fight. His 11-inch guns would speak first, and they would speak with the kind of authority that only the largest naval cannons could command. The signal flags rose on the Graf Spee's masts. Her gun crews tensed at their stations. The distance between the ships continued to close, and the morning light that had been so serene minutes before suddenly seemed to crackle with violence waiting to happen. The Exeter was the first British ship to open fire, and her guns roared across the water with a sound like the end of the world. The concussion from her 8-inch shells leaving the barrels created a physical shock that could be felt decks below. The shells followed their trajectory across the sky, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then water erupted around the Graf Spee as the British rounds fell close, sending spray higher than the German ship's mast. The aim was not yet perfect. Naval gunnery was as much art as science, and the first rounds were meant to bracket the target, to establish the range. But the meaning was clear. The British were not bluffing. They were not testing or probing. They were attacking with genuine intent. Langsdorff's voice cut across the bridge of the Graf Spee, and her massive 11-inch guns swung to track the Exeter. When they fired, the sound was different from the British guns. Deeper, more resonant, the sound of greater power being launched. The shells that left those barrels were half again as heavy as the Exeter's rounds, and they carried far more destructive potential. They crossed the space between the ships with terrifying speed, and when they began to fall near the Exeter, they threw up water spray so tall that lookouts on the light cruisers had to blink and refocus to see through the curtains of ocean that bloomed on the horizon. The The first salvo missed. The second salvo was closer. The third salvo would not miss. Ajax and Achilles, the two light cruisers, were not merely passive observers in this exchange. Their role was to distract, to divide Langsdorff's attention, to present targets that the German captain could not ignore. As the Exeter bore down on the Graf Spee from the south, Ajax worked her way around to port and Achilles to starboard. Their 6-inch guns were smaller, less powerful, but they had advantages of their own. They were faster than the armoured cruiser, more manoeuvrable, crewed by men who understood that they were in a fight against superior firepower and could only win through speed and positioning. The British light cruisers began laying smoke screens, billowing artificial fog across the water to obscure their positions and make targeting more difficult. Their guns barked and cracked, not with the deep authority of the larger cannons, but with a staccato rhythm that suggested speed and aggression. The smoke rolled across the sea in thick white clouds, and through it, the British ships manoeuvred like dancers moving through a fog, visible one moment and hidden the next. The Graf Spee's gun crews had to divide their attention among 3 different targets, and that was precisely what Harwood had intended. The German captain could not bring his superior firepower to bear against a single opponent when he was surrounded by 3 separate threats, each one demanding attention, each one capable of inflicting damage. The terrible mathematics of naval gunnery began to assert themselves as the minutes passed and the distance between the ships continued to contract. At this range, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 12,000 metres, the effectiveness of each gun increased exponentially with each kilometre lost. The shells travelled slightly faster through less air, the trajectories became flatter, the likelihood of a hit increased geometrically. Every moment that passed brought the antagonists closer to the range where dodging a shell became nearly impossible, where one accurate shot could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. The crews in the gun turrets and magazines did not think about these abstract calculations. They thought about the next shell, the next order from the fire control officer, the next adjustment to the guns. They thought about keeping their hands steady and their minds focused. Down in the magazines of the Exeter, ammunition handlers passed shells and cordite charges in a choreography they had practiced hundreds of times. Up in the turrets, the guns elevated and trained, following the calculations that came from the fire control officer, who was reading the rangefinder and the spotting observations, making adjustments, sending corrections. The entire system was a marvel of coordination and training, and it only worked if every person did their part perfectly. The Graf Spee's 11-inch shells continued to fall near the Exeter, and the British cruiser's captain and crew knew that it was only a matter of time before one of those massive rounds found its target. The water around her erupted in great spouts of white, the near misses creating waves that rocked the ship and tested the nerves of men who could see the enemy fire but could not dodge it. The Exeter was committed to her course now, driving forward at the Graf Spee, her guns still thundering defiance. Her crew knew what awaited them. They knew that when those shells began to hit, when the metal stopped falling in the water and started tearing into the hull and the superstructure, casualties would follow. Some of them might be their shipmates. Some of them might be themselves. This was the cost of aggression, the price paid by the attacker who chose to close the distance and force the issue. But they also knew that their captain, Frederick Bell, would not have ordered this charge unless he believed it was necessary, unless the mathematics and the strategy called for it. And so they gripped their stations and waited for the moment when prediction became reality, when near misses became hits, and when the battle ceased to be a contest of positioning and became a matter of endurance and will. Ajax and Achilles continued their dance around the periphery, laying smoke and firing their smaller guns, presenting problems for the German crew to solve. The coordination between the three British ships was not accidental. It was the product of weeks at sea together, of officers who understood each other's capabilities and limitations, of a commander who had thought through the scenarios and communicated his intentions clearly. Harwood remained aboard the Ajax throughout, his signal flags flying, his calm demeanor and steady voice carrying across the water through the wireless and through the steady stream of orders that flowed from his bridge. A commodore who panicked would have doomed his ships. A commodore who hesitated would have wasted the advantage of surprise. But Harwood was neither panicked nor hesitant. He was a man committed to his decision, and every order he issued, every maneuver he directed, was calculated to maintain the pressure on the German cruiser and prevent her from settling into a methodical, long-range duel where her superior firepower would have been decisive. The sea churned and the smoke rolled and the guns roared, and for a few moments that stretched like hours, the outcome of the war in the South Atlantic hung in complete suspension, unknown even to those whose lives were being spent to determine it. The opening minutes of this battle revealed the truth that naval warfare had become something more complex than a simple exchange of cannon fire. It was psychology as much as gunnery, positioning as much as firepower, the willingness of a commander to gamble on an unconventional approach, balanced against the expectations of professional military doctrine. Harwood had violated the textbook by attacking an opponent with superior firepower. He had done so deliberately and with full understanding of the risks, but he had done so because he understood that the textbook was written by people sitting in comfortable offices far from the battle, and that sometimes the most conventional wisdom was actually the most dangerous kind of thinking. By forcing Langsdorff to react, by refusing to retreat and instead attacking, by placing three ships where they could no longer be ignored individually and could not all be destroyed simultaneously, Harwood had created a battle of a different kind than the one Langsdorff might have preferred. The Graf Spee's commanding officer would have much rather engaged the British cruisers at extreme range, where his 11-inch guns would have been overwhelming and his heavier armor would have protected him from their smaller weapons. Instead, he was forced into a fight where aggression and positioning mattered as much as raw firepower, where the enemy had seized the initiative and was not going to yield it without paying a terrible cost. The battle had begun in the way that only Harwood's boldness could have begun it, and now the physics and the courage and the terrible calculus of naval warfare would determine where it would end. The morning light that broke across the River Plate on the 13th of December was harsh and unforgiving. The Exeter, smallest of the three British cruisers under Commodore Harwood's command, had crossed the horizon at dawn to find her worst nightmare made manifest. The Graf Spee sat before her like a coiled predator, and within moments of visual contact, both ships understood what was about to unfold. Harwood's tactical gamble, to attack immediately despite being outgunned, meant the Exeter would charge directly into the teeth of the German raiders' main armament. Her commanding officer, Captain Frederick Bell, understood with absolute clarity what his orders meant. The Exeter would draw the Graf Spee's fire. She would absorb punishment that a ship her size was never designed to withstand. And in doing so, she might just give Ajax and Achilles the opening they needed to coordinate their own attack and overwhelm their opponent through sheer tactical audacity. The Exeter's guns opened fire first, her 6-inch guns sending shells across the water toward the German cruiser at a range of roughly 18,000 yards. The explosions erupted around the Graf Spee's hull, and for a fraction of a second there was hope. The distant hope that perhaps the British could replicate their audacious strategy and somehow overcome the odds. But the Graf Spee's response was immediate and devastating. Her 11-inch guns, each one capable of punching through armor plating as if it were paper, answered with a roar that seemed to shake the very air itself. The first salvo from the German raiders' main batteries was a ranging shot, but subsequent salvos found their mark with terrible efficiency. These were not ancient cannons or poorly maintained weapons operated by inexperienced crews. The Graf Spee's gunnery officers were professionals, trained in an environment where precision and lethality were the only acceptable standards. And when an 11-inch shell traveling at approximately 2,700 miles per hour strikes a ship, the results are catastrophic. The first major hit tore into the Exeter's forward superstructure with a force that killed everyone in the wheelhouse instantly. The shell exploded with such violence that the entire bridge structure was effectively obliterated, scattering fragments across the deck and stunning the crew with the sudden loss of all command and communication from the main control station. Captain Bell himself was killed in that same explosion, along with nearly everyone around him. The command of the Exeter passed in seconds to whoever could reach the emergency control station, a backup location below deck, established precisely for moments when the primary bridge became untenable. The British sailors who ran through the smoke and chaos to reach that secondary command post did so knowing their captain was dead, knowing their ship was already badly damaged, and knowing that the punishment was only beginning. In that moment, the Exeter ceased to be a coherent fighting unit and became instead a collection of compartments filled with terrified men fighting fires, tending wounded, and continuing to operate their weapons as if the ordered world they knew still existed. The fires that erupted across the Exeter's superstructure burned with the intense heat of burning oil and wood and paint and flesh. The smoke rose in great black columns that were visible for miles across the water, and the flames spread with a hunger that seemed almost alive. The ship's damage control parties, brave men who had trained for this moment but could never truly prepare themselves for the reality of it, worked with desperate energy to contain the spreading infernos. They sprayed water from hoses, they sealed off compartments, they fought the fire by compartment and corridor, all while the ship continued to buck and shudder beneath them from the impact of German shells. The Exeter's complement knew that if the fires reached the main ammunition magazines deep in the ship's heart, the entire vessel would be transformed into a funeral pyre. Every man aboard understood this threat on an almost instinctive level. The fear of being trapped in a steel box filled with flames and toxic smoke, of drowning in compartments flooded by the sea, of being vaporized in an instant by an explosion. These fears drove the crew to work beyond normal human limits, to function as a unit despite the chaos and the horror. The Exeter's own guns continued to fire, despite the catastrophic damage being inflicted upon her. The 6-inch turrets, operated by crews who were now receiving information through damaged communication systems and increasingly by word of mouth, kept up their barrage against the Graf Spee. The gun crews worked in conditions that would have caused most men to abandon their posts. Some turrets were in direct line of fire from the German raiders' main battery. The armor plating that protected them from shrapnel offered almost no protection against a direct hit from an 11-inch shell, and yet the men stayed at their posts, loading shells, adjusting aim, firing again and again. They knew that the survival of their ship, and perhaps the success of Harwood's entire strategy, depended on maintaining their rate of fire. To abandon their posts would be to surrender their one contribution to the battle. So they remained, and they fired, and many of them would not survive the day. Another massive salvo from the Graf Spee found the Exeter's engine rooms. The explosion that followed was different from the fires raging above deck. It was a deep, terrible sound that spoke of massive structural damage at the very heart of the ship. The Exeter's engineering crew, Men who had been maintaining the complicated machinery that powered the cruiser through the waters of the South Atlantic, felt the blast wash through their compartments like a wave of destruction. Steam pipes ruptured, spilling scalding vapor into the air. Electrical systems failed, plunging portions of the engine room into darkness broken only by the light of small emergency lamps. And yet the engineering teams worked to keep what systems remained operational, knowing that their ship needed every bit of propulsion she could generate to remain in the battle. The Exeter began to slow, her ability to maneuver limited by the damage to her engines. She was being bound helpless, while the Graf Spee continued to savage her with methodical precision. The list, the angle at which the Exeter was tilting to one side, began to increase as compartments below the waterline flooded with seawater. The ship's hull, breached in multiple locations by German shells, was taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. The list made it increasingly difficult for the gun crews to maintain accurate fire. The decks became steep and treacherous underfoot. Men working in the turrets found themselves operating their weapons at impossible angles, straining against gravity itself to keep their guns pointed at the enemy. The damage control parties, already working at the limits of human endurance, now had to contend with the additional horror of water pouring in through gaps in the hull, through ruptured bulkheads, through compartments that had been breached by shell fire. Some men were trapped in compartments by the rising water and had to be abandoned, their fates sealed by the terrible logic of naval warfare, where you cannot save everyone and you must make impossible choices about who lives and who dies. And yet the Exeter's guns continued to fire, even as her hull was being torn apart by German artillery, even as fires consumed her superstructure, even as her list increased and her ability to maneuver diminished toward zero. The guns of the Exeter continued to spit shells across the water toward the Graf Spee. The significance of this cannot be overstated. By maintaining her rate of fire despite catastrophic damage, the Exeter was fulfilling her role in Harwood's strategy perfectly. She was holding the German raiders' attention. She was forcing the Graf Spee's gunnery officers to continue engaging the nearest British ship. And most importantly, she was keeping the Graf Spee in place long enough for Ajax and Achilles to maneuver into positions where they could concentrate their own fire on the German cruiser. The Exeter's guns were not trying to destroy the Graf Spee. They could not hope to do so against the heavier German armament. Instead, they were holding the German raider in a tactical embrace, preventing her from maneuvering freely, from concentrating her fire on the other British ships, from breaking away and running for the horizon. The crew of the Exeter worked in conditions that words can barely capture. Imagine the darkness of compartments deep in a ship's hull, broken only by emergency lighting. Imagine the sound of metal groaning and screaming as stress was applied to the ship's frame in ways her designers never intended. Imagine the heat of fires raging above, the cold fear of knowing that your ship is sinking beneath you, the knowledge that you might be about to die in the steel prison of a warship going down into the sea. Imagine the smoke that filled passages and compartments, so thick that you could barely see your own hands in front of your face. Imagine the fear in the voices of your shipmates, the screams of the wounded, the silence of the dead. And yet the crew of the Exeter performed their duties. They fought the fires, they manned their stations, they operated their weapons, they saved their shipmates when they could. They bore witness to the death of their captain and their comrades, and kept functioning, because to stop functioning meant the failure of everything Harwood's gamble was trying to achieve. The Exeter absorbed punishment that should have sunk her outright. She took hit after hit from the Graf Spee's 11-inch guns. Her hull was torn open in multiple places. Her superstructure was ravaged by explosions and flames. Her list grew so severe that some compartments became impossible to access, and yet she remained afloat. She remained fighting. The engineering crews, working in flooded compartments and failing light, kept enough power flowing to her guns and her engines to keep her in the battle. The gun crews, working with bleeding hands and burning lungs and terror in their hearts, continued to load and fire again. The damage control parties, depleted by losses and working with increasingly primitive methods as sophisticated equipment failed, battled the flames and the flooding with the kind of desperate courage that defines the men and women who serve in warships. The Exeter should have sunk. The mathematics of naval warfare suggested she should have sunk within minutes. And yet she endured, and she fought, and she continued to perform her role in the broader battle strategy. The tragedy and the triumph of the Exeter's sacrifice lies in the fact that her crew knew, in a way that only sailors truly can, that their ship was being pushed beyond her design limits. Every explosion, every impact, every listing degree spoke of the boundaries of the ship's hull and systems being exceeded. The men in her engineering spaces knew her engines were dying. The men fighting fires knew they were fighting a losing battle against blazes that fed on the very materials of the ship herself. The gun crews knew that their superstructure was deteriorating around them with every German salvo, and yet they continued. They continued not because they believed they would survive. Many of them knew they probably would not. They continued because stopping meant allowing the Graf Spee to maneuver freely and potentially finish her work with the crippled Exeter. They continued because their shipmates in Ajax and Achilles depended on them holding the German raider in place. They continued because the discipline and training and tradition of the Royal Navy demanded that a ship fights until she can no longer do so. The Exeter remained in the battle for approximately 2 hours of the most intense naval combat seen since the First World War. During that time, she was struck repeatedly by German shells. Her fires raged unchecked, despite the best efforts of her crew to extinguish them. Her list increased until some of her gun turrets became unusable because they could no longer train their weapons accurately on target. Her casualty list grew as more and more of her crew fell to enemy fire or were lost trying to contain the damage ravaging their ship. And yet, when Captain Langsdorff eventually made his decision to break off combat and head for Montevideo, the Exeter had done her job. She had held the German raider's main firepower engaged. She had prevented the Graf Spee from using her superior gun range to stand off and obliterate Ajax and Achilles without consequence. She had enabled Harwood's tactical gamble by absorbing the blow that was meant to break the British formation. The crew of the Exeter had paid a terrible price for this success, but they had paid it willingly, and their sacrifice had mattered. In the days and weeks that followed, the surviving crew of the Exeter was rescued, and the ship was eventually scuttled because her damage was too extensive for repair in the field. The men who had fought her during the battle against the Graf Spee had witnessed something that changes a person forever. The moment when you understand that your courage and your training and your willingness to endure can actually matter, can actually affect outcomes that reach far beyond your own survival. The Exeter's guns had not destroyed the Graf Spee, but they had helped drive the German raider from the field. Her sacrifice, the loss of life, the destruction of the ship, the terrible suffering of her crew, had contributed to a British victory that boosted morale when it was desperately needed, and demonstrated that Hitler's raider could be defeated by determination and tactical brilliance. The Exeter's name would live in British naval tradition as a symbol of what courage and sacrifice could accomplish, and the men who served aboard her would carry the memory of that battle for the rest of their lives. The Exeter was dying, and both sides knew it. Smoke billowed from her superstructure in thick, oily plumes that rose hundreds of feet into the grey South Atlantic sky, turning day into a murky twilight. Her forward turrets hung silent, their guns trained uselessly skyward as fires consumed the gun crews inside. The mighty 11-inch shells of the Graf Spee continued to fall around her, sending up geysers of white water that drenched her already burning hull. But even as the Exeter's power faded, Captain Langsdorff faced a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. He could not afford to finish her quickly, because two smaller British cruisers were about to make themselves impossible to ignore. Commodore Harwood's gamble was not a single throw of dice. It was a choreographed trap, and now the most delicate and dangerous part of the dance was beginning. The Ajax and Achilles, the light cruisers that had been hanging back from the opening minutes of contact, were preparing to close the distance and insert themselves directly between the German raider and her wounded British opponent. Light cruisers were not designed for gun duels with ships armed with 11-inch weapons. Their 6-inch guns fired shells that weighed about 100 pounds, less than 1/3 the weight of the Graf Spee's ammunition. At ranges of 10,000 to 20,000 yards, the difference in destructive power was almost mathematical certainty. A direct hit from a light cruiser gun might damage a heavy ship's paint or perforate a fuel tank. A direct hit from the German raider could split a light cruiser's hull, tear apart her superstructure, and kill hundreds of men in the flash of an instant. The officers commanding the Ajax and Achilles, both experienced naval men who understood these realities with absolute clarity, had decided in those first moments of battle that their ships would engage anyway. Captain William E. Parry commanded the Ajax, and Captain William G. Woodward led the Achilles. Both men understood that their purpose was not victory in the traditional sense, it was denial. They would not allow the Graf Spee to use her superior firepower with impunity. They would force engagement, divide attention, create chaos in the enemy's targeting solution, and above all, they would keep Captain Langsdorff's attention fixed on them instead of on finishing the stricken Exeter. This was the brutal calculus of naval warfare at its most unforgiving. They were volunteering their ships to be shot at so that another ship might survive. What made the Ajax and Achilles effective in this role, however, was not merely courage or sacrifice. Both light cruisers had been designed and built specifically for the kind of rapid maneuvering and quick tactical adjustments that would characterize the next hours of battle. They were smaller than the Exeter, displacing roughly 6,500 tons compared to the Exeter's 8,500 tons, which meant they were faster. While the Exeter could manage roughly 32 knots in ideal conditions, the Ajax and Achilles could sustain speeds in excess of 34 knots. More importantly, they could accelerate quickly, change direction without losing momentum, and recover from rapid helm movements with an agility that heavier ships could not match. Their hulls were narrower, their superstructures more compact, and their engines more responsive to the commands of their helmsmen. In the chaotic environment of battle, with shells falling all around and visibility obscured by smoke and spray, this responsiveness meant the difference between being hit and missing the strike by meters. The captains of these two ships understood that speed was their only real defense, and that constant movement was their only real weapon. By the time the Ajax and Achilles began their coordinated attack, the Exeter had already fallen behind, and to starboard of the main engagement, her combat effectiveness severely compromised, but her presence still casting a shadow over the tactical situation. Langsdorff had been forced to divide his attention between 3 targets instead of 1, and even though he possessed sufficient firepower to deal with all 3 simultaneously in theory, the practical reality of gunnery in wartime was far more complex. His fire control systems required time to acquire targets, calculate range, compensate for wind and wave movement, and adjust firing solutions based on splash observations from previous salvos. Every time the Ajax or Achilles made a sudden turn, altered course, or laid down a smoke screen, the German gunnery officers had to reset their calculations. The human factor remained dominant in naval gunnery, despite all the mechanical sophistication of fire control computers. The men operating those instruments worked under extreme stress, aware that enemy shells were falling around them, breathing air thick with smoke and cordite fumes, and knowing that a single moment of lost concentration could result in a catastrophic miss that allowed enemy fire to concentrate on their own ship. The Ajax maneuvered to port and began laying a smoke screen, moving between the Graf Spee and the Exeter with a boldness that bordered on suicidal. The smoke screen was not merely defensive, it was an offensive weapon of a sort. By obscuring the line of sight between the German raider and the British cruiser, the Ajax forced Langsdorff to either cease fire or continue shooting at targets he could not clearly see. Continuing to fire blind was wasteful of ammunition and demoralizing to gun crews who could not observe the effects of their salvos. Ceasing fire meant allowing the enemy time to maneuver, reposition, and potentially inflict damage that could not be undone. The Achilles, meanwhile, had taken position to starboard of the action, maneuvering to keep the Graf Spee's attention divided between multiple directions. Her 6-inch guns were hammering away at the German ship, the recoil of each broadside shaking the entire hull, despite the light cruiser's relatively light construction. The shells from her guns were far too small to inflict the kind of catastrophic damage that the Exeter's 8-inch weapons could deliver, but they added to the overall chaos and forced the German damage control parties to respond to new fires and new flooding in compartments far from the waterline. The Graf Spee's captain and his gunnery team were exceptionally skilled, among the finest in the German Navy, but they were now facing a tactical situation that had transformed from a simple engagement with one British cruiser into a multi-vector threat. The British light cruisers were not standing off at extreme range and trading shots. They were actively maneuvering, forcing continuous changes in firing solutions and angles of approach. The Exeter, despite her damage, continued to fire whenever her remaining guns could bear on the target. The coordination among the 3 British ships was not a matter of radio chatter giving explicit orders. Radio silence was maintained during battle because radio transmissions could be intercepted, and also because the noise of the battle itself made clear communication nearly impossible, but rather a matter of professional understanding and tactical instinct. Each captain knew what the others needed, and each moved in ways that complemented the overall strategy of keeping the German raider pinned down and unable to concentrate her fire on any single target long enough to deliver a series of devastating hits. Time began to lose its normal meaning in the noise and confusion of battle. What felt like hours to the men being shot at passed as only minutes on the clock. The Ajax's gunnery team reported near misses from the Graf Spee's salvos, shells that passed close enough to shake the light cruiser's frame and shower the deck with spray and fragments. One shell struck the Ajax's superstructure, not with a full impact, but with enough force to dent plating and wound 3 men near the impact point. The Achilles sustained similar damage from near misses and a few direct hits that failed to penetrate her thin armor. These were not the kind of catastrophic strikes that could cripple a ship, but they were reminders that the Graf Spee's firepower remained formidable and that the light cruiser's survival was not guaranteed simply because they were trying their best. The smoke screens grew thicker as the battle wore on, fed by the burning oil and destroyed superstructure of the Exeter, and by the deliberate smoke-laying of the Ajax and Achilles. The battle began to resemble a nightmare vision of chaos, where visibility extended only a few thousand yards in any direction, and where enemies could appear and disappear like ghosts in the murk. What was becoming apparent to Captain Langsdorff as the minutes turned into hours was that his tactical situation had deteriorated from favorable to genuinely uncertain. The Graf Spee had suffered cumulative damage that was beginning to affect her combat capability. Shells from the British guns, particularly the heavier salvos from the Exeter before she fell out of effective range, had struck his ship repeatedly. One shell had penetrated the armor protection around an engine room and caused flooding that forced him to reduce speed. Another had damaged the fire control radar system, forcing his gunnery officers to rely on optical observations alone. The superstructure of the ship bore the scars of multiple hits, with fires breaking out in several locations despite the crew's desperate efforts to control them. Most critically, the psychological weight of facing multiple opponents who would not stay still, who would not break under fire, and who continued to maneuver and fight despite suffering obvious damage, was beginning to take its toll on the crew's morale. The men serving the Graf Spee were not cowards, but they were now engaged in a battle that had evolved far beyond the simple commerce raiding for which they had been trained and prepared. The Ajax and Achilles were by this point operating almost as a single coordinated vessel, despite being separate ships. When one made a dash to lay smoke, the other would shift fire to draw the Graf Spee's attention. When one took a hit and needed to break contact momentarily to assess damage, the other would surge forward to maintain pressure. The light cruiser's guns were inferior in raw destructive power, but the cumulative effect of multiple guns firing continuously was beginning to add up. Fires were spreading across the Graf Spee's decks from hits that, individually, might have been survivable, but collectively were creating a situation where damage control was becoming overwhelmed. The German ship's damage control parties were excellent and professional, but no group of men can repair all the damage being inflicted faster than it is being created when they are under continuous fire from multiple directions. The great armoured cruiser, built in the 1930s as a monument to German engineering and German will, was being degraded and diminished by the coordinated assault of three smaller, seemingly less capable opponents. This was the price of engaging three enemies instead of one. The mathematics of naval gunnery changed entirely when you could not focus your fire. By the second hour of the battle, the tactical situation had shifted in a way that no one could have predicted at the opening moments of contact. The Graf Spee remained the most powerful ship on the field. Her 11-inch guns still delivered twice the striking power of any other weapon present, but she could no longer deliver that power with the overwhelming advantage she had enjoyed at the start. The Exeter was out of the effective combat zone, hanging back in the smoke and spray with her guns, mostly silent, her crew fighting fires and trying to keep her from sinking. The Ajax and Achilles were damaged and hurting, but they were still maneuvering, still firing, still maintaining the coordinated attack that was preventing Langsdorff from concentrating his efforts on any single target. The British light cruisers were doing exactly what Commodore Harwood had intended. They were denying the German raider the luxury of focusing her undivided firepower on crippling one opponent at a time. They were trading the possibility of being sunk for the certainty that they would make the enemy's task more difficult, more painful, and less likely to result in a clean British defeat. This was courage not as glorious drama, but as professional calculation, understanding the odds, acknowledging the danger, and proceeding anyway, because there was no alternative and because the cause demanded it. What neither the British crews nor Captain Langsdorff could have known at that moment was that the cumulative effect of these decisions, Harwood's decision to attack despite inferior firepower, the decision of Parry and Woodward to maneuver aggressively and divide the enemy's attention, and the decision of Langsdorff to accept battle in the first place, would determine not merely the outcome of this single engagement, but the strategic calculus that the German raider would face over the next few days. The battle was still ongoing, the outcome still uncertain, and the cost in lives and ships still being tallied in real time. But the moment when the Graf Spee might have destroyed her opponents one by one, crushing the Exeter with overwhelming firepower before turning to deal with the light cruisers, had passed. That window of tactical opportunity had closed the moment the Ajax and Achilles began their play of smoke and speed and coordinated fire. The light cruisers, together with the dying Exeter, had done what they were asked to do. They had kept the line, they had held the engagement, and they had made it impossible for the German raider to turn a comfortable advantage into a complete British defeat. What would happen next remained to be written, but the first act of this drama had shown that firepower alone was not sufficient to win at sea, that tactics, courage, and the willingness to maneuver under fire could change the mathematics of battle and force even the most overwhelming force to reconsider its assumptions about inevitable victory. The battle had been raging for just over 2 hours when the fabric of reality began to shift inside the Graf Spee's command center. Captain Hans Langsdorff stood at the heart of controlled chaos, watching damage reports arrive like autumn leaves. Constant, troubling, impossible to stop. The ship's 11-inch guns had found their targets multiple times, and the British cruisers bore the scars of superior German firepower. Yet superiority in firepower meant nothing if the ship carrying those guns could no longer move. The engines that had driven the raider across thousands of miles of ocean were now compromised, stuttering and laboring as steam escaped from ruptures in the hull. Langsdorff's hands remained steady, his voice measured, but the mathematics of naval warfare were turning against him with each passing minute. Around him, officers calculated fuel consumption, assessed structural integrity, and whispered urgent assessments that the captain heard all too clearly. The British ships had not retreated. They had not surrendered. They had not even broken formation. They had simply refused to die, and in refusing, they had begun to transform the nature of the engagement itself. The damage to the Graf Spee's systems had accumulated with the relentless mathematics of combat. A direct hit had penetrated the ship's hull below the waterline, not catastrophically, but enough to force the crew to begin counter-flooding to maintain stability. The ship's fuel oil tanks had been damaged by shell fragments, creating a steady leak that meant every hour of travel would burn through reserves at an accelerated rate. The superstructure, that delicate arrangement of fire control systems and radio masts that allowed Langsdorff to command his vessel, had been scarred and damaged. Most critically, the turret machinery controlling the forward 11-inch guns had been disabled by a British shell that had struck with brutal precision. The gun crews could still operate the weapons manually, but the efficiency that had defined German gunnery was gone, replaced by a slower, more labored process that ate away at the ship's combat capability. Langsdorff's chief engineer reported that the damage to the diesel engines meant the ship could not sustain her full speed without risking catastrophic mechanical failure. The raider that had outrun merchant vessels and eluded hunting groups for months was suddenly, brutally limited. The ship that had been designed to be faster than anything it could not sink was now slower than the British light cruisers that harassed her from across the water. What made Langsdorff's situation even more precarious was the nature of the intelligence reaching his bridge. Intelligence that would prove to be both accurate and fatally misleading. British wireless operators had been transmitting messages throughout the battle, messages designed to be intercepted by German radio surveillance, messages suggesting that powerful British reinforcements were racing toward the South Atlantic as the combat unfolded. One transmission mentioned the battlecruiser Renown, a ship mounting 9.2-inch guns, a weapon that could pierce the Graf Spee's armor at range where the German cruiser could not effectively reply. Another mentioned the aircraft carrier Eagle, a platform from which naval aircraft could attack the raider beyond the horizon where her guns could not reach. Whether these transmissions were accurate reflections of actual British movements or brilliant deception campaigns designed to break Langsdorff's will became almost irrelevant in the moment. The captain received the reports, processed them through the lens of his knowledge about British naval dispositions, and arrived at a conclusion that felt inevitable. If heavy British reinforcements were approaching, if the Graf Spee could not reach Buenos Aires or a friendly port at full speed, if the ship's battle damage meant she could not fight her way through a modern battlecruiser, then continuing to engage the British cruisers would only expose her to destruction from a force she could not hope to defeat. Langsdorff faced a command decision that no training and no naval academy could truly prepare a man to make. Around him, his crew was fighting with extraordinary courage and skill. The gun crews, despite the damage to their turrets and the difficulties of manual operation, were still placing shells that struck the British vessels with frightening regularity. The engine room teams were working in conditions of intense heat and danger, managing the flooding, keeping the screws turning despite the mechanical damage that threatened to seize them at any moment. The young sailors manning the damage control parties were racing through the ship's corridors, sealing bulkheads, fighting fires, tending to the wounded. These men had entered this battle believing in their captain, believing in their ship, and believing that German naval power would carry them through. Now, in the space of 120 minutes, Langsdorff had to decide whether that belief was justified or whether continuing the fight would simply be sending these men to their deaths for no strategic purpose. The battle had already proven that the small British ships would not flee, would not break, would not accept defeat. The question was whether continuing the engagement would lead to ultimate German victory or only prolong the agony before inevitable surrender or destruction. The decision to break off combat was announced quietly, without drama or visible doubt, though the officers around Langsdorff could sense the weight of it. The order was given to cease fire and alter course toward the River Plate and Montevideo, the neutral port in Uruguay, where the laws of naval warfare, governed by international convention, guaranteed certain protections and timeframes. The ships that had been pressing forward through the smoke and noise of battle now began their withdrawal, the 11-inch guns falling silent as the Graf Spee turned away from her pursuers. This was not retreat in the traditional sense. The British ships did not chase triumphantly across the water, did not fire final devastating salvos into the raiders' fleeing stern. Instead, there was a sudden, almost surreal quiet. The smoke that had been churned by shell fire and explosions began to dissipate. The sea, which moments before had been a place of violent collision and dying men, returned to something approaching normalcy. The British cruisers, their crews exhausted and their ships damaged, did not pursue aggressively. Harwood's vessels were low on fuel, their ammunition depleted, their crews stretched to the absolute limit of human endurance. The Commodore had learned what many commanders discover too late, that victory in naval warfare is often determined not by a single knockout blow, but by the willingness of both sides to continue fighting when continuation seems impossible. As the Graf Spee limped away from the battle zone, the crew began to process what had happened. The ship's casualty list grew as medical personnel completed their triage and counted the dead and wounded. The gun crews, their muscles shaking from exertion and stress, began to understand that they had not been defeated by inferior numbers, but only by time and damage, and the terrible calculus of modern warfare. For many of these sailors, the realization that their captain had chosen to disengage when victory seemed possible created a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the shooting had stopped, profound disappointment that they had not carried the day, and a growing understanding that their situation was far more precarious than they had imagined when they had set out from German ports months before. The damage control parties were still fighting fires, still managing flooding, still assessing the structural integrity of their vessel. The engineers in the engine room were coaxing every last revolution out of machinery that was operating beyond safe limits, knowing that the ship's speed toward Montevideo determined the fate of every man aboard her. What Langsdorff could not fully know, as he navigated his damaged ship toward neutral waters, was how profoundly his decision would echo through the remainder of the war. The British had sent 3 light cruisers against a heavily armed raider, had seen their flagship, the Exeter, torn apart by German gunnery, had suffered hundreds of casualties, and yet they had achieved their objective through sheer force of will and Harwood's brilliant tactical conception. The Commodore had gambled everything on the principle that aggressive action, when applied at the right moment against an opponent of uncertain resolve, could produce results disproportionate to the relative strength of the opposing forces. Langsdorff's decision to disengage, reasonable as it seemed in the moment, would prove to be the beginning of the end. The captain was moving towards sanctuary, believing he was preserving his ship and his crew, but he was actually moving toward a situation that would offer him no good choices, only variations on defeat and despair. The next 72 hours would transform a naval battle into an international incident, a military defeat into a political crisis, and a tactical withdrawal into something far more consequential. The sea between the battle zone and Montevideo was covered by the winter darkness of the South Atlantic, darkness that hid the extent of the Graf Spee's wounds from casual observation, but could not hide them from the German captain himself. Langsdorff knew that his ship was damaged, that his fuel was limited, that his ammunition had been depleted through hours of combat. He knew that the British were behind him, maintaining contact, perhaps gathering reinforcements, perhaps attempting to herd him toward additional forces positioned to intercept him before he could reach safety. The wireless operators aboard the raider were monitoring British communications, trying to separate fact from deception, trying to understand what forces were truly being committed to the pursuit. Every message they intercepted added weight to Langsdorff's burden, every report of an approaching capital ship tightening the knot of tension in his chest. The captain, who had spent months operating independently across vast oceans, now found himself trapped in a shrinking circle of available options, each one more unsatisfactory than the last. The approach to Montevideo was made in conditions of increasing tension, the ship limping through the darkness, her engines laboring, her crew exhausted from the battle and from the desperate repairs undertaken in the aftermath of combat. As the city lights appeared on the horizon and the ship moved into the estuary, Langsdorff must have felt a moment of temporary relief. He had brought his vessel to neutral waters, where international law provided specific protections and constraints. The ship could not be attacked while in harbour, could not be seized by force without violating Uruguay's neutrality, could not be subjected to the indignities of surrender or capture, or so the law proclaimed. What the captain could not anticipate was how international law and military necessity would collide in the coming days, how the British would use deception and diplomacy as weapons just as effectively as they had used shells and gunnery, how the refuge he sought would become a trap far more inescapable than any battle. The decision to break off combat had saved the ship from immediate destruction. The decision had preserved the lives of his crew, at least for the moment. The decision had bought time to assess the damage, to consider options, to plan for the future. Yet it had also set in motion a chain of events that Langsdorff, for all his experience and judgment, could not prevent. A commander's perception of the situation shapes the decisions he makes, and those decisions in turn shape the future. Langsdorff had perceived his situation as militarily untenable, as offering no path to victory or even to acceptable survival. He had acted on that perception with the professionalism and caution that had defined his career. But perception, no matter how informed, no matter how carefully reasoned, can sometimes be a lens that distorts as much as it clarifies. The real world continued on beneath the surface of men's plans and assumptions, indifferent to their hopes and fears, waiting to reveal the consequences of choices made in moments of uncertainty and doubt. The afternoon sun caught the scarred hull of the Graf Spee as she limped through the outer roads of Montevideo on the 13th of December, 1939. Her superstructure bore the unmistakable signatures of combat: twisted metal, dark scorch marks, splintered railings where British shells had found their mark. The ship that had sailed into the South Atlantic as a symbol of German naval superiority now crept into neutral waters like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Captain Hans Langsdorff stood on what remained of his bridge, his uniform torn and stained, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a man who had just fought his first and possibly final battle. Around him, the crew moved with the mechanical precision of shock, securing lines and assessing damage that seemed to grow more severe with each passing hour. The River Plate estuary, with its shallow waters and the city of Montevideo rising beyond, represented more than mere refuge. It was the first real test of whether law and diplomacy could matter when two nations were locked in total war. The British cruisers remained beyond the horizon, maintaining their vigilant watch. HMS Exeter, despite her own horrific injuries, had been able to limp toward the Falkland Islands to undergo temporary repairs, while HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles took up station in the approaches to Montevideo, their guns trained toward the estuary mouth and their crews remaining at battle stations. The British blockade was neither aggressive nor threatening in the traditional sense. It was a wall of presence, a constant reminder that escape would mean fighting again, and this time against ships waiting with fresh ammunition and clear purpose. Commodore Henry Harwood had positioned his remaining vessels perfectly, knowing that Captain Langsdorff would recognize the trap. The German captain could see them out there, could estimate their firepower, could calculate the odds just as clearly as Harwood had calculated that the Graf Spee would come here. What neither man knew with certainty was that the British were broadcasting false signals into the radio ether, fabricating messages about reinforcements, about the battle cruiser Renown rushing southward at maximum speed, about a naval force being assembled that did not exist and would not arrive for many days, if at all. The harbour itself became the stage for a struggle that would play out not with guns or torpedoes, but with law, negotiation, and the brutal mathematics of neutral sovereignty. Uruguay, a small nation seeking to remain untouched by the greater conflict engulfing Europe, suddenly found itself at the intersection of German and British interests. International law, established by generations of treaties and maritime conventions, provided a framework that everyone recognized, but which everyone sought to manipulate. The Hague Convention of 1907 regulated the behavior of warships in neutral ports with precise and binding rules. A warship in distress could enter a neutral harbor for repairs, but only those repairs necessary to make the vessel seaworthy enough to reach her own country or the nearest neutral port. She was not permitted to carry out repairs that would enhance her fighting capability. She was not permitted to take on ammunition or fuel beyond what would allow for safe passage. And crucially, she was permitted to remain in that neutral port for no more than 24 hours, or 72 hours in exceptional circumstances involving repairs to the ship's hull or machinery necessary to ensure the safety of the crew. Captain Langsdorff requested the 72-hour extension, claiming that the damage to his engines, fuel systems, and hull required more time than a single day would allow. The Uruguayan government, understanding the gravity of the decision and seeking to demonstrate fairness to both parties, eventually granted the extension. The clock began its countdown toward a deadline that would force one of the most consequential decisions of the entire naval war. What happened in those 3 days would echo far beyond the River Plate, would shape German naval strategy for years to come, and would mark a turning point in British morale that coincided with some of the darkest hours of the conflict. But in those first hours after Langsdorff's arrival, none of that was certain. All that was certain was that a ship lay in harbour, her captain faced impossible choices, and a nation at war was watching to see what would happen next. The German naval attaché in Buenos Aires, aware of the situation developing just across the River Plate in Montevideo, began sending urgent messages to Berlin. The reports detailed the condition of the Graf Spee, the composition of the British force, the diplomatic complications of the Uruguayan neutrality, and most critically, the question of whether escape was possible or if the ship's fate was sealed. From Berlin came responses weighing the options, discussing the political implications of scuttling a modern warship against the propaganda value of losing her to British guns. Admiral Raeder, commanding the Kriegsmarine, understood the strategic catastrophe that the loss of such a valuable ship would represent. But he also understood that honour demanded alternatives be explored. Langsdorff found himself caught between directives from Berlin, the physical limitations of his damaged ship, the legal constraints of Uruguayan neutrality, and the terrible knowledge that every passing hour brought potential reinforcements for the British blockade. The British, meanwhile, moved with equal urgency to reinforce their narrative about approaching warships, to ensure that Langsdorff would believe that escape was impossible, that resistance was futile, and that his only choices lay between internment or destruction. In the port city itself, a different battle was unfolding with equal intensity. German diplomats and British diplomats engaged in the peculiar play of wartime neutrality, each attempting to shape the interpretation of Uruguayan law in their favour. The British made subtle threats about trade sanctions, about the implications of appearing to favour Germany in a conflict that democratic nations were fighting for their survival. They spoke of how the United States, not yet in the war, but sympathetic to British interests, would view any Uruguayan action that facilitated German operations. The Germans, by contrast, appealed to Uruguayan pride and sovereignty, arguing that the British blockade itself violated neutral territorial waters, and that justice demanded the Germans be allowed to repair their ship and depart safely. Both sides mobilized their intelligence services, their diplomatic corps, and every available tool of persuasion. Journalists converged on Montevideo, turning the technical question of warship repairs into an international crisis that gripped the world's press. The harbour became a focal point of human attention in a way that no naval engagement ever could be, because it represented the collision of law, morality, and national interest in their purest forms. The crews aboard the British cruisers maintained their vigil with a different kind of intensity now. The battle was over, or seemed to be, but in some ways the tension had only increased. Men who had been fighting for their lives now had to endure the uncertainty of waiting, of not knowing what would happen next, of understanding that their work might have been in vain if the German ship somehow escaped the harbour and made a break for the open ocean. The damage assessment teams working below deck aboard Exeter reported that the ship had suffered catastrophic harm, that her wounds were so severe that she represented more of a liability than an asset to the British war effort. Yet she had survived. She had prevented the Graf Spee from destroying the Ajax and Achilles outright, had forced Langsdorff to break off combat and seek safety rather than continue the engagement and risk losing his ship entirely. There was grim satisfaction in that knowledge, but it was mixed with the recognition that nothing was truly settled until the Graf Spee herself was dealt with. The blockade had to hold, the negotiations had to succeed, the diplomatic pressure had to mount, because if Langsdorff found a way to escape, if he managed to slip out of Montevideo and return to raiding, then everything the British had sacrificed would feel hollow and incomplete. Inside the harbour, the German crew worked with desperate urgency to assess what could be repaired within the 72-hour window. Engineers who had designed the ship's systems in Berlin found themselves scrambling to understand the extent of the damage dealt by British gunnery. The fuel system had been ruptured in multiple places. The engine room had suffered hits that would require weeks of work to fully remedy. The command tower was a twisted ruin of metal and shattered equipment. The turrets that housed the powerful 11-inch guns were damaged, reducing her combat effectiveness substantially. Langsdorff walked through his ship like a man viewing the death of something he had created, something he had been responsible for protecting. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Every man aboard looked to him for answers, for guidance, for the promise that their situation was not hopeless. But privately, in the moments when he stood alone and allowed himself to think truthfully about what he was facing, Langsdorff knew that his options had contracted to a terrible narrowness. The British broadcasts about the renown continued, false messages flowing into the ether with just enough plausibility to seem real. A battlecruiser was a ship that could destroy the Graf Spee without breaking formation. One battlecruiser versus a damaged cruiser was not a battle, it was an execution. Langsdorff would have known that the moment he heard the reports. The question that consumed him was whether those reports were true. Did Harwood actually have reinforcements approaching? Was the British blockade about to be reinforced with a heavier ship that would make any breakout attempt suicidal? Langsdorff was not a man prone to panic, but he was a man trained in the mathematics of naval warfare, and those mathematics suggested that his margin for success had vanished. The damage his ship had sustained meant she could not outrun a heavier opponent. The 72 hours allowed for repairs could not transform her into a ship capable of fighting her way through a British battlecruiser and the cruisers already waiting outside the harbour. The laws of physics and warfare were against him, and no amount of German engineering could change them in the time available. The cables exchanged between Langsdorff and Berlin grew increasingly desperate. Each report to the German Naval Command was met with responses that seemed to oscillate between the desire to preserve the ship and the political impossibility of abandoning her to the enemy. Langsdorff understood the symbolism of the Graf Spee just as clearly as anyone in Berlin did. She was the proof of German rearmament, the demonstration that Germany could build ships that matched or exceeded British design standards, the physical embodiment of national pride and military ambition. To lose her would be a devastating blow to German prestige at a moment when prestige was still relatively intact, when the Wehrmacht was still viewed by many as an unstoppable force. To save her would require Langsdorff to somehow fight through the blockade, to risk not only his ship but the lives of his crew on a maneuver that the odds suggested would fail. The contradiction could not be resolved. There was no solution that would preserve both the ship and the crew, no outcome that would satisfy both Berlin and the demands of basic military logic. Montevideo itself had become a city transformed by the presence of the German warship. The port was the economic lifeblood of Uruguay, and the sudden arrival of a crippled combatant had created chaos. Ship captains were uncertain whether it was safe to enter the harbour. Neutral merchant vessels were afraid to operate in waters where a major naval engagement had just taken place and might take place again. The Uruguayan government struggled with the implications of the crisis, acutely aware that any decision they made would alienate one side or the other and potentially bring consequences. British diplomats suggested that international law was being interpreted too generously, that the Hague Convention should be read strictly, that 72 hours was excessive, and that the ship should be forced to depart on a compressed timeline. German diplomats countered that the law was clear, that neutral nations had obligations to honor treaties, and that any attempt to force the Graf Spee to leave before her crew was assured safe passage would constitute a violation of Uruguayan sovereignty and a threat to German nationals. The diplomatic cables flew back and forth, each side pulling at the threads of international law seeking advantage, finding instead only the complexity and ambiguity that law always contained when applied to matters of war and survival. What neither side could fully control was the psychological impact unfolding within the German ship herself. Langsdorff moved through his vessel like a man sleepwalking, observing the damage, assessing the repairs, understanding with each passing hour that the 72 hours represented not a reprieve, but a countdown to a decision he did not want to make. His crew looked to him, but what could he tell them? That they would fight again and likely die? That they would attempt to escape and be sunk in international waters? That they would surrender their ship and face imprisonment? That they would scuttle the vessel themselves, destroying the work of thousands of German workers and the symbol of German naval pride? Each option was unacceptable in its own way. Each represented a kind of defeat that Langsdorff could barely contemplate. Yet contemplate he must, because the clock on Montevideo's walls was counting down, and time was something that waited for no man, that granted no extensions beyond the agreed deadline, that moved with the indifference of physics itself toward a moment of reckoning that could no longer be avoided or delayed. The British ships remained in position, their crews watching the harbour, their commanders calculating probabilities and maintaining the pressure of presence. They did not know that the messages they were broadcasting about the renown would prove so effective that the suggestion of a heavier warship approaching would lodge itself so firmly in Langsdorff's mind that it would influence the most consequential decision of his life. They did know that they had achieved something remarkable, that 3 light and medium cruisers had forced a modern raider to break off combat and seek refuge, that Commodore Harwood's gamble had paid dividends greater than he had any right to expect. What remained to be seen was whether they could hold their pressure long enough for the situation to resolve itself, whether diplomacy and naval threat would combine to eliminate the Graf Spee as an active threat to British shipping and British interests. The waiting continued, hour by hour, with the 72-hour deadline approaching like a storm that could be seen on the horizon but could not be escaped, only endured and faced when it finally arrived. In the afternoon of December the 13th, 1939, the Graf Spee limped through the neutral waters of the River Plate estuary and dropped anchor in Montevideo harbour. She was a broken ship now. The British shells had torn through her superstructure, smashed her fire control systems, and punched holes in her armour that no quick repair could seal. Her engines laboured under damage that would take weeks to remedy, and her fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Captain Hans Langsdorff stood on what remained of his bridge, watching the city lights of Montevideo reflected in the dark water, knowing that he had perhaps 72 hours to decide the fate of his vessel, his crew, and himself. The clock had begun ticking the moment his ship touched bottom in neutral territory, and with each passing hour, the walls of his options grew narrower. Under international maritime law, a warship seeking shelter in a neutral port was bound by strict protocols. Uruguay, officially neutral in the conflict raging across Europe and the Atlantic, would permit the Graf Spee to remain for repairs, but only for 72 hours. After that time expired, the ship must either depart to sea and resume operations or face internment, her crew held prisoner for the duration of the war. It was a rule designed to prevent neutral harbors from becoming permanent bases for warring nations, and it transformed Montevideo into something far more complex than a simple refuge. The city became a stage for diplomacy, deception, pressure, and the collision of laws with the raw calculations of war. Every official, every government representative, every newspaper editor now had a role to play in determining whether the Graf Spee would live or die. The British Admiralty, watching from across the Atlantic and through the reports of their agents in South America, understood precisely what was at stake. They were desperate to prevent the Graf Spee from returning to sea. A damaged raider was still a raider, and even crippled, she possessed firepower that could wreak havoc on Atlantic shipping lanes for months more. But the Admiralty also understood that they could not simply sink a ship in a neutral harbor. Such an action would violate Uruguayan sovereignty and potentially turn the South American nation against British interests at a critical moment in the war. Instead, they turned to a weapon as old as conflict itself: information warfare. They began spreading reports, some rooted in fragments of truth and others pure fabrication, about the forces converging on Montevideo. The most potent of these rumors concerned the battle cruiser Renown. The Renown was a genuine warship, a powerful vessel capable of outgunning the Graf Spee with ease. She was, however, thousands of nautical miles away when these reports began circulating through Montevideo. The British had sent her south weeks earlier in response to the threat posed by the German raider, but she was still somewhere in the South Atlantic, days away from the river estuary at best. What mattered, however, was not the Renown's actual location, but what Captain Langsdorff believed about her location. If he was convinced that a battle cruiser was already positioned outside the harbor, ready to intercept any attempt at escape, then his calculations about survival shifted fundamentally. A commerce raider cannot fight a battle cruiser and hope to win. The mathematics of naval warfare are unforgiving, and Langsdorff knew them better than any man aboard his ship. The German naval attaché in Buenos Aires, working through various intermediaries and informants, soon reported to Langsdorff that the Renown was in fact approaching. He received additional information suggesting that other British reinforcements were being rushed south, perhaps a force so overwhelming that escape would be tantamount to suicide. Whether these reports represented accurate intelligence or were instead the product of British disinformation efforts became almost irrelevant. In the fog of war, a commanding officer must act on the information available to him, and the information available to Langsdorff in those 72 hours was deliberately designed to lead him toward a specific conclusion. That escape meant death. The British officers orchestrating this campaign of strategic deception understood that Langsdorff was not the kind of man to sacrifice his crew needlessly. If he truly believed that the Renown was waiting to pounce the moment he cleared the harbor, then the only honorable choice left to him might be to prevent that encounter entirely. But the pressure came from multiple directions simultaneously, layering despair upon doubt upon isolation. Langsdorff was exhausted. He had commanded his ship through months of hunting across 2 oceans, through constant vigilance and impossible decisions about when to attack and when to hide. He had tried to wage commerce war while maintaining some code of honor, warning ships, permitting evacuations, respecting the Geneva Convention, even as the war around him grew increasingly brutal. Now he was isolated in a neutral port in Argentina, far from any superior officer who might share the weight of command, far from any source of reinforcement or assistance. The German embassy in Buenos Aires was powerless to help militarily. His own government, through radio communications that took hours to transmit across the vast Atlantic, was distant and unreachable for meaningful consultation. He was alone with his damaged ship, and the knowledge that his time in the harbor was running down like sand through an hourglass. The Uruguayan government, meanwhile, was caught in its own diplomatic quandary. They wished to remain neutral, but the British presence outside their harbor was an undeniable pressure. The British ships maintained their blockade, and British diplomats pressed their case through official channels and through the media. If the Graf Spee were allowed to escape and then later attacked neutral shipping in the South Atlantic, Uruguay might be blamed for permitting a warship to use its harbor as a base for ongoing operations. The risk of becoming entangled in the conflict, of having their neutrality questioned or violated, weighed on Uruguayan officials. The British, sensing this anxiety, skillfully exploited it. They made certain that the Uruguayan government understood the gravity of their concerns about allowing the Graf Spee to depart. In a way that stopped just short of threats, they conveyed the message that Uruguay's relations with Britain might suffer if the raider were permitted to leave the harbor fully repaired and ready for battle. The newspaper war added another layer of psychological pressure. Buenos Aires papers, influenced by British diplomacy and the natural drama of the situation, reported with increasing certainty that a powerful British fleet was gathering offshore. Some accounts spoke of the Renown specifically, others of destroyers and cruisers hurrying south at maximum speed. Each report that reached Langsdorff, each confirmation from his own intelligence sources, added weight to the growing conviction that he was trapped. His options narrowed with each passing hour. He could attempt to repair the Graf Spee fully within the 72-hour window, though his engineers assured him this was impossible. The damage was too extensive, the work too complex, the time too short. He could fight his way out, knowing that the Renown or whatever forces awaited him would likely prove superior. He could attempt to scuttle the ship in neutral waters as a final act of defiance, preventing the British from capturing her, but also ending his career as a German naval officer in ignominy. Or he could order his crew to resist capture and possibly die in a futile last stand against overwhelming odds. These were not truly options at all. They were variations on defeat, each carrying different consequences, but all leading toward the same destination. A career officer trained in the traditions of the German Navy faced the collapse of everything he had worked for, everything he believed about his duty and his honor. Langsdorff had sunk merchant vessels, yes, but he had done so according to his understanding of the rules of warfare. He had tried to be humane in an increasingly inhumane conflict. He had commanded with dignity and restraint. Now all of that seemed to have led him to this moment, anchored in a neutral harbor with a damaged ship, isolated from meaningful support, watching the clock count down toward a deadline that promised only catastrophe. The 72 hours allowed by international law were not simply a technical requirement. They were a prison sentence. Every conversation with Uruguay's maritime authorities, every exchange with the British blockade force outside the harbour, every message received from German naval headquarters in Berlin emphasized the same terrible reality. The ship could not be properly repaired. The crew could not be saved from capture or internment. The raider that had haunted Allied shipping for months was, in the end, just another damaged vessel running out of options in a war that was progressively closing off escape routes for Germany's scattered forces across the globe. The British had fought the Graf Spee with guns and tactics on December the 13th, but in the days that followed, they fought her with information, with diplomatic pressure, with the calculated spreading of uncertainty. And they discovered that psychological warfare could be as devastating as any artillery barrage. Langsdorff moved through his final days in Montevideo as a man caught between worlds. He was still a captain of the Third Reich, expected to preserve his ship and his honor through whatever means remained available. He was also a humane officer who could not bear the thought of leading his crew into a suicidal battle or into years of captivity. He was a naval professional who understood that his situation was tactically hopeless, and a man of conscience who wrestled with what his duty truly meant when all apparent paths led to disaster. The weight of command, which had pressed upon him throughout his journey across the Atlantic, now became almost unbearable. Every conversation with his officers, every look from his crew, every moment of reflection in his cabin must have felt like another stone added to a burden that no man could sustain indefinitely. The British blockade outside the harbour remained in position, and reports continued to arrive about reinforcements approaching from various directions. Whether these reports were true or false mattered less than what Langsdorff believed about them, and the mental architecture of despair that had been carefully constructed through rumour, intelligence, diplomatic pressure, and his own isolated exhaustion pointed toward a single conclusion. There was no escape. There was no way to save his ship, no way to fulfill his duty to Germany, no way to avoid either captivity or death in combat. The diplomatic storm had transformed the simple mechanics of naval warfare. Which ship was faster, which had more guns, which possessed the better tactics, into something far more complex and far more devastating. It had transformed the question from, can he escape, into, should he survive by escaping, and does he wish to live under the circumstances that would result? For Hans Langsdorff, as the 72 hours began their final countdown, the answer to that second question was increasingly difficult to affirm. The sun rose over Montevideo on the 17th of December, 1939, casting long shadows across the River Plate. Inside the harbour, the Graf Spee lay at anchor, her grey hull pocked with shell holes and streaked with rust-coloured rust stains running down from damaged superstructure. 4 days had passed since her battle with the British cruisers, 4 days of mounting desperation as Captain Hans Langsdorff faced an impossible decision that would define the closing hours of his life. The ship that had sailed from Germany as a symbol of Nazi naval power now floated in neutral waters like a wounded animal, trapped between the certainty of battle and the shame of destruction. Around her, the city of Montevideo continued its ordinary routines, unaware that one man's choice would reshape the remainder of the Second World War in the South Atlantic and beyond. The crew, numbering over 1,000 men, had spent those 4 days repairing what damage they could, maintaining strict discipline and waiting for orders that everyone suspected would lead to their final action. Langsdorff had requested the 72-hour window under international law, claiming he needed time to make the Graf Spee seaworthy enough to reach Germany for proper repairs. The claim was partially truthful but fundamentally misleading. Damage to the ship's fire control systems and fuel storage tanks ran far deeper than yard work in a neutral port could remedy in 3 days. The captain knew this. He knew his engines would struggle under full power. He knew his guns would be less accurate than before. He knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, the British ships waited. 3 cruisers had bloodied his vessel once. What reinforcements might be coming now? The radio operators reported that British wireless traffic suggested the battlecruiser Renown was steaming south to intercept him. Whether the information was accurate or a fabrication designed to demoralize the German crew, Langsdorff could not know with certainty. What mattered was that he believed it. What mattered was that he was exhausted, his decisions worn thin by days of combat and negotiation, and the weight of commanding a modern warship with 1,000 souls depending on every order he gave. The diplomatic pressure had not let up. Uruguayan officials, caught between German aggression and British power, had informed Langsdorff that the Graf Spee must leave port by the evening of the 17th, or face internment under international maritime law. There would be no extension. The deadline was absolute. This meant that by sunset, Langsdorff must either attempt to break through the British blockade in a ship that was damaged and poorly positioned to fight, or he must accept internment, which would mean the crew would be imprisoned for the duration of the war. A third option existed, one that few captains contemplated: destruction. To order the sinking of his own ship was to defy the Reich, to waste resources, to admit defeat in the most public and dramatic fashion imaginable. It was also to save the lives of his crew, to deny the British a prize, and to preserve German naval honor in the form of a defiant final act, rather than allowing the ship to be captured or scuttled as a salvage operation. Langsdorff wrestled with these options for hours, consulting with his officers, receiving updates on the ship's condition, and trying to calculate whether any path forward led to anything other than catastrophe. The captain chose destruction. Deliberate, ordered, controlled destruction. He would scuttle the Graf Spee in the shallow waters of the River Plate estuary, denying her to the enemy while preserving his crew's lives and maintaining a thread of German dignity in defeat. The order was issued in the early afternoon of the 17th, conveyed first to his senior officers and then to the crew. There would be a final journey out of the harbour. The ship would steam toward open water, and then, in international waters beyond Uruguayan territorial limits, she would be deliberately sunk. Every man would be accounted for, every attempt made to ensure no lives were lost in the scuttling process. It was not the end Langsdorff had imagined when the Graf Spee left her moorings months earlier, armed with hope and Nazi ideology. It was not the end the Reich had imagined either, but it was the end the captain had decided upon, and his subordinates would execute the order without hesitation. By mid-afternoon, the crew of the Graf Spee was mustered on deck, informed of what was to happen, and ordered to prepare for abandonment. Sailors carried essential documents, personal effects, and wounded men to the upper decks.